The vote was already in motion when the gavel bell rang the second time, and Iliot Sorn felt the floor of the threshold accord chamber tilt beneath her the way it always did when a decision that could not be recalled was about to become real. 911 delegates, 6 syllables left in the reading. The word powerless was already on the arbiter's lips before Iliot's own file. Her file, the one she had inherited and never once revised, finished scrolling across the display ring above the floor. By the survey of record, filed and unamended for 141 years, said High Arbiter Petrus Vol, his voice carrying to every one of the chamber's 40 tiers without strain, this accord finds the species designated human, homeworld Sol 3, to possess no defensive capacity meeting the threshold of contested territory. The system is declared open. The claim of the Volt Combine is recognized. The bell rang a third time. It was done. 3 tiers down and 200 meters east, in the gallery reserved for the Combine's observers, Overseer Rin Caldry did not smile. Her kind rarely did anything so unguarded in public. But her 4 hands folded together in the posture Iliot's species called satisfied closure, and somewhere in the vaulted dark above the chamber's false sky, a bell that was not the arbiter's bell began, faintly, to toll for a war that had not yet been declared, because no one there believed it would need declaring. Iliot Sorn sat very still in the archivist's gallery, her chitinous fingers laced together over the file she had never opened past its summary page, and told herself that the unease climbing her spine was nothing more than the weight of watching a 141-year-old sentence become an act. She was wrong about that, though it would be some hours yet before anyone in the chamber understood how wrong. The file had her mentor's signature on it, not hers. Kato Ram, dead 9 years, had walked the Sol system's outer worlds himself as a junior cataloger a century and a half ago, in the brief window when the Accord still sent living surveyors instead of drones, and had filed the report that everyone since had simply carried forward, unread, renewed by clerical habit rather than by anyone actually looking again. Iliot had inherited the file the way a house is inherited, furniture included, assumptions included, the load-bearing walls never once inspected. She had read it exactly once on her first day as adjunct cataloger 22 years ago. Population, scattered agrarian remnants and isolated industrial pockets. Void capability, none observed beyond low orbit. Threat classification, null. Recommended status, open resource territory, contingent on future claim. She had read it once and then, like everyone before her, she had simply renewed it. 12 times. The 12th renewal had her own signature at the bottom, dated 11 months ago, and it was that signature, her own hand, her own chitin-tipped mark, that the arbiter had just read into the permanent record as the legal basis for opening an inhabited system to armed annexation. She did not know, sitting there with her hands laced tight enough to ache, that 400 light-years away a human named Naomi Voss was standing on the command deck of a ship with no listing in any archive on any world represented in that chamber, watching a status display change from dormant to armed, and thinking, with the particular calm of someone who has waited a very long time for a day she hoped would never come, that the vote had finally happened. And now they would finally get to find out whether a century of patience had been wasted. It had not been wasted, but that too would take a while to become clear. The chamber was already emptying by the time the Combine's war room, 11 decks below the observation gallery of Overseer Caldry's flagship, began its own kind of ringing, not a bell, but the bright triumphant chime of an operational order cleared for execution. Marshal Drethkos had been waiting for that chime for 4 months, ever since the Accord Survey Committee had first scheduled the Sol reading, and when it finally sounded across the war room's vaulted ceiling, he did not hesitate before speaking the order that would commit 11,400 vessels of the Volt Combine to a system the legal record insisted held nothing capable of resisting them. "Fleet Marshal," said his aide, a narrow, quick-eyed officer named Sten Havo, "the Accord ruling is confirmed. Sol is open." Koss looked at the tactical display, a system rendered in soft amber light, 9 planets and a scatter of debris fields, one small blue world circled in the claim-pending color that would, in the next several hours, change to the color that meant Combine property, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, something close to satisfaction. "Then signal the fleet," he said. "Tell them Sol belongs to whoever arrives first with enough guns to hold it. Tell them we intend to be first." Havo's fingers moved across the command table, and 11,400 ships, arrayed across 4 staging fields in Combine-controlled space, began, in near-perfect unison, to power their drives. None of them knew yet that the number that would matter in the end was not 11,400. It was 206. Iliot did not go home after the reading. She went instead to the sublevel archive, where the Sol file's source documents were kept in cold storage, a courtesy the Accord extended to any cataloger who wanted to double back on a ruling after the fact, though almost no one ever did. The archive clerk on duty, a stooped old Thren named Ovit Mar who had catalogued longer than Iliot had been alive, raised nothing so dramatic as an eyebrow when she requested the full unabridged Sol file rather than the summary. "Bit late for that," he said, not unkindly sliding the drive case across the counter. "Votes read, rulings final. Combine's probably already burning fuel." "I know," Iliot said. "I want to see what I signed." She took the case to a reading alcove and opened it, and for the first 90 minutes found exactly what she expected. Page after page of Kato Raham's careful, unhurried survey notes, describing a species that built with stone and steel and burned chemical fuel to leave its own atmosphere, that had no orbital defense worth the name, that fought its wars against itself with weapons that could not reach beyond its own sky. It was, if anything, a kinder assessment than the summary implied. Raham had noted, almost fondly, that the humans built cathedrals and wrote long poems about small things and seemed, despite everything, unusually stubborn for a species with so little to be stubborn about. It was in the file's back third, in a section that had clearly never been opened by anyone renewing the license in the intervening century, that Iliot found the part that made her sit up. Raham had appended a note, dated 4 years after his original survey, flagged for follow-up and never followed up on. Return visit. Survey team could not achieve stable sensor lock on approximately 11% of near-system volume, attributed to instrument fault. Recommend resurvey with upgraded equipment. There was no record of a resurvey. There was no record of anyone ever reading the note at all. Iliot checked the renewal log, her own signature, 11 times over, each one a simple confirmation that the file remained accurate, none of them accompanied by so much as a glance at page 406. 11% of near-system volume. She did the rough math in her head, the outer belts, the long cold dark past the ninth world, the places a species with chemical rockets and cathedrals would have no plausible reason to occupy, and every plausible reason to leave unsurveyed and unexplained. She thought about instrument fault, and she thought about how convenient a phrase that was, and for the first time in her professional life felt something colder than embarrassment climb up through her sternum. She was still sitting with the file open when the first dispatches from the Combine Advance Elements began arriving at Sol. 4 months hard burn compressed by the fleet's newest drives into 6 days, and the true shape of the day's mistake began, very quietly, to assemble itself in the dark past the ninth world. The Advance Elements, 900 light escort vessels under a junior flotilla commander named Raven, arrived at the edge of the Sol system expecting exactly what the file promised: nothing. What they found instead was 41 ships arrayed in a loose defensive line at the edge of the third planet's cislunar space, hulls that even a cursory scan identified as decades obsolete. engines burning at output levels a Combine cruiser would consider embarrassing for a training exercise. Raven laughed when the tactical readout resolved. She had commanded escort flotillas for 11 years and had never once seen a defending force arrive at a fight already outmatched by this margin. "Signal the flotilla," she told her second. "Formation Golden Line. We take the 41 and hold position for the Marshal's main body." It took, by the flotilla's own after-action log, 4 minutes and 11 seconds to reduce all 41 human vessels to expanding debris. Raven did not lose a single ship. She did not, in that first engagement, take so much as a scratch to her own hull's paint. She recorded the encounter in her log as textbook. Precisely the outcome the Sol file had predicted, delivered with a precision that made the file look, if anything, generous. What she did not know, what no one on her flotilla's bridge, nor Marshal Cass's staff 4 days behind her, nor High Arbiter Val's chamber 400 light-years distant, had any way of knowing, was that the 41 ships had been decommissioned Earth defense hulls, obsolete by design, crude at minimum, and stripped of anything that might have made their destruction cost the Combine even a moment's pause. They had been sent forward for exactly one purpose, which they had accomplished flawlessly: to be scanned, catalogued, destroyed, and reported home as confirmation that the Sol system's defenses were precisely as toothless as the century-old file claimed. Somewhere beyond the 9th planet, in the cold dark that Kato Ram's instruments had failed to penetrate 145 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with instrument fault, 1,140 vessels registered the destruction of the 41 decoys on their own passive sensors, logged the data without comment, and did not move. Not yet. Raven's flotilla advanced into cislunar space to begin the work. The Combine's legal claim entitled it to establishing a forward staging perimeter, deploying the first extraction platforms toward the debris-rich asteroid fields the survey listed as the system's only resource of note. And it was there, 6 hours into an occupation that felt, to every officer involved, like paperwork rather than war, that Ensign Tavi Korsh, 26 years old and 3 months out of the Combine Sensor Academy, found something on his console that made no sense at all. "Commander," he said, and had to say it twice before Raven, occupied with extraction platform telemetry, looked up. "I'm reading a mass signature at the edge of the belt." He stopped, checked the readout again, adjusted a filter that should not have needed adjusting. "It's returning a density reading that doesn't correspond to any material class in the registry." Raven crossed the bridge and looked at his display herself. The signature was faint, diffuse, more suggestion than object. The kind of return a sensor gave when it was picking up a gravitational lensing artifact rather than a solid hull. The kind of ghost every long-range scan produced a dozen times a shift, and that every competent sensor officer learned to filter out before it cluttered a report. "Debris shadow," she said, "or a comet core with heavy metal content. Filter it and refresh the survey grid." "Yes, Commander," Korsh filtered it. It came back 4 minutes later, in exactly the same location, at exactly the same faint diffuse density that matched nothing in any registry the Combine Sensor Academy had ever taught him to recognize. And this time, though he did not say anything to Raven because he did not want to be told a second time that he was cluttering a report with a comet core, Tavi Korsh quietly flagged the return in his own personal log, appended a note that read "return in 4 minutes, same coordinates. Density anomalous," and went back to his extraction telemetry with the particular unease of a young man who has just been told, twice, not to trust the thing his instruments were plainly showing him. He was not wrong to be uneasy. He was, in fact, looking, without knowing it, without any way of knowing it, directly at the edge of a dark matter shroud field wrapped around 1,140 human warships that had been sitting in that exact volume of space, powered down to a whisper, running passive sensors only, for 6 years, waiting for a vote that 400 light-years away had just been read into the Threshold Accord's permanent record. The shroud held, the ships did not move. And 1,140 kilometers inward of Tavi Korsh's console, aboard a vessel with no name in any Combine or Accord registry, Commodore Naomi Voss watched the same faint gravitational signature bleed through her own passive returns. The mirror image of what Korsh was seeing, the telltale of a Combine sensor sweep brushing the outer edge of the shroud and finding just enough to flag, not enough to prove, and made a note in her own log. In words considerably calmer than the ones racing through the young ensign's mind 4 light-minutes away. Contact confirmed. Combine advance elements at extraction range. Hold position. Wait for main body. She was 34 years old, and she had been waiting, in one capacity or another, for 11 of those years. And if the wait went another 6 days before the Marshal's main fleet arrived and gave her the target worth revealing herself for, she found, a little to her own surprise, that she did not mind. Some things were worth doing exactly once, and worth doing right. 6 days passed in the Sol system, the way 6 days pass for an occupying force that believes the war, such as it was, is already finished. Raven's flotilla expanded its perimeter, seeded extraction platforms across the inner belt, and filed daily reports back to the Marshal's incoming main body that grew, with each transmission, more perfunctory. The tone of an administrator confirming that yesterday's paperwork was still correctly filed today. Tavi Korsh kept his private log. The anomalous return came back 9 more times over those 6 days, always in slightly different coordinates, always at that same maddening, unclassifiable density, and on the 7th occurrence he did something he knew was likely to earn him a reprimand. He cross-referenced the returned signature against the flotilla's full historical sensor archive, going back through every scan the Combine had ever taken of the outer Sol system, including the century-old survey data Kato Ram's expedition had filed. He found the gap immediately. It was right there in the metadata, buried under 145 years of routine renewal stamps, 11% of near-system volume, unresolved, attributed to instrument fault, never resurveyed. The exact same coordinates. The exact same faint, ghostly, unclassifiable density that his own console kept returning, and that he kept being told, correctly by every rule of sensor discipline, to filter out as noise. He did not file a report. Junior ensigns 3 months out of the academy did not file reports that contradicted a 145-year-old survey their own marshal had used as the legal basis for the entire operation. But he stopped filtering the return, and he started keeping his own private count, and by the time Marshal Koss's main body, 10,500 vessels arrayed across 7 staging groups, drives burning bright enough to be visible from the 4th planet's surface with unaided eyes, arrived in Sol cislunar space on the morning of the 6th day, Tavi Korsh had privately logged the anomalous signature appearing, in slowly shifting positions, 41 times. 41. He noticed the number and did not know what to make of it, and filed it away as coincidence, because the alternative, that something out there was moving in a pattern that echoed the exact number of decoy ships his own flotilla had destroyed on the first day, was not a thought a junior sensor officer had any comfortable way to hold. 400 light-years distant, the Threshold Accord's emergency session had been called for an entirely different reason, and Elliot Sorn stood at the archivist's podium with Kato Ram's uncatalogued follow-up note projected on the display ring above her, watching High Arbiter Val's expression shift from patient tolerance to something considerably less patient. "You are telling this session," Val said, "that the survey underlying the Combine's claim contains an 11% gap that was never resolved." "I am telling this session that the survey says so itself," Elliot said, "in its own appendix, filed by the original surveyor, flagged for follow-up, and never followed up on by anyone, including myself, across 11 renewals for which I take full responsibility." She kept her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. "I am not asking the Accord to reverse a ruling on sentiment. I am asking this session to consider that we may have authorized an armed annexation of a system we have not actually surveyed in a century and a half, on the strength of a document whose author himself doubted its completeness." Overseer Rin Caldry, seated in the Combine's gallery with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that agitation reads as weakness, rose to respond before the arbiter could rule. "With respect to the adjunct cataloger's diligence," Caldry said, and the word diligence carried just enough weight to make it an insult, "the Combine's forward elements have now held Sol cislunar space for 6 days, without meeting resistance of any kind beyond the 41 obsolete vessels destroyed on first contact. If there is a hidden capability in that system, Adjunct Sorn, it has had 6 days and 41 dead ships worth of provocation in which to reveal itself. It has not done so. I submit that this is not a gap in survey data. It is confirmation of it." It was, Iliot had to admit, watching the chamber's mood shift visibly back toward the Combine's favor, a hard argument to answer with nothing more than an old man's unresolved footnote, and a feeling in her chest she could not fully justify. High Arbiter Vol looked from Caldry to Iliot and back, weighing 41 dead ships and 6 quiet days against a 145-year-old margin note, and made the decision that decades of institutional caution had trained him to make. "The ruling stands," he said. "The Combine's claim is confirmed. Adjunct Sorn, your diligence is noted for the record, and I would ask that the full resurvey you propose be scheduled, at standard priority, once current operations conclude." Standard priority. Once current operations conclude. Iliot understood, hearing the words, that she had just watched an institution choose the comfort of an old answer over the cost of a new question, and that there was nothing more she could do about it from the archivist's podium except sit back down and watch the display ring for whatever came next. She did not have to wait long. The incident that would later be called, in every Combine after-action report, and every Accord inquiry that followed, the perimeter event, began at 3:47 Fleet Standard on the 7th day, when a routine Combine patrol corvette, designation Vault 7th Line, 40 crew, on nothing more dramatic than a scheduled sweep of the extraction platform perimeter, strayed 900 kilometers past its assigned patrol boundary, while chasing down a sensor ghost its own junior officer had flagged as probably nothing. It was not nothing. The corvette's active sensor sweep at close range and full power did what 6 days of passive Combine scanning had failed to do. It punched, for 11 full seconds, through the outer edge of the dark matter shroud protecting the nearest picket of the hidden fleet, and returned before the shroud's automated countermeasures corrected the intrusion. A solid, unmistakable, impossible contact. Hull mass in the megaton range. Profile matching no registry entry in any database the corvette's computer had access to. A shape, for those 11 seconds, that looked less like a ship than like a fracture in the dark itself. Edges too sharp, proportions too wrong, sitting motionless 400 kilometers from where the corvette's sensors insisted there had been nothing at all a minute earlier. The corvette's captain, a competent, unremarkable officer named Res Doven, who would spend the rest of his career being asked about the 11 seconds that made him briefly, unwillingly famous, did exactly what his training told him to do. He transmitted the contact data on flotilla-wide broadcast, ordered his ship to full reverse thrust, and got 900 kilometers of retreat behind him before whatever he had glimpsed did anything at all. What it did, in the end, was nothing dramatic. The shroud reasserted itself. The contact vanished from every sensor in the sector as cleanly as if it had never existed. But the 11 seconds of data had already transmitted, had already reached Raven's flagship, had already begun climbing the reporting chain toward Marshal Koss's own bridge, and for the first time since the vote had passed 400 light-years away, Someone in the Combine's chain of command sat looking at hard sensor data. Not a footnote, not a filtered ghost, not a junior ensign's private unease, but 11 full seconds of a contact that should not, by every law the Combine survey relied on, exist at all, and felt the first real cold finger of doubt. Aboard the ship that had, for 11 seconds, briefly and involuntarily shown itself to a frightened Combine patrol crew, the picket commander, a young lieutenant named Ren Akafer, 28 years old, 3 years into a command he had trained his whole adult life to hold, filed his own contact report up the Longwatch chain, with considerably more composure than Rest Doven had managed in the other direction. Shroud integrity briefly compromised, Sector 9 picket source, Combine Patrol Corvette active sweep, duration 11 seconds, no engagement, recommend continued hold, awaiting Commodore's order. Naomi Voss read the report at her own station 400,000 kilometers away, and looked for a long moment at the tactical plot showing the full Combine main body now arrayed across cislunar space. 10,500 fresh hulls added to the 900 already in system, extraction platforms multiplying across the belt, an occupation settling in with every hour that passed like it intended to stay. "Hold," she said. "Let them wonder. We're not ready to answer that question yet, but soon." She was not being cruel, and she was not enjoying the wait the way Overseer Caldry might have enjoyed it in her place. She had grown up on stories of the last time humanity's ancestors had let an enemy underestimate them for too long, and had spent 11 years of her adult life making sure it would never happen that way again. But there was a discipline to this kind of patience that she had trained herself into as carefully as she had trained her body to withstand the crushing accelerations the Longwatch pattern hulls were capable of, and she was not going to abandon that discipline now. 400 kilometers and 11 seconds from the moment everything the Combine believed about Saul was about to become obsolete. Soon, she thought again, watching the plot. Not yet, but soon. Marshal Koss gave the order that ended the waiting 18 hours later, and he gave it for reasons that had nothing to do with 11 seconds of anomalous sensor data, and everything to do with the plain administrative logic of a claim that would not be considered fully perfected under Combine law until a sovereignty beacon had been physically anchored in orbit of the system's inhabited world. "Extraction operations in the belt can continue on schedule," he told his staff, standing over the tactical table with the ease of a man closing out a long and successful campaign. "But the claim isn't finished until the beacon's down. Detach the 3rd and 5th battle groups, take them in system, anchor the beacon in orbit of the 3rd planet, and record the ceremony for the Accord's registry. I want this closed before the Accord's next session, so no one has the chance to reopen Adjunct Sorn's little footnote." It was, by the numbers on his own tactical display, an absurdly small commitment for what remained, on paper, an entirely uncontested system, 940 warships, drawn from the 3rd and 5th battle groups, more than sufficient to escort a ceremonial beacon laying past a homeworld whose entire recorded defensive capability consisted of 41 obsolete hulls already reduced to debris. Koss did not expect resistance. He expected at most a few hours of uneventful transit and a data recorder's footage of a Combine flag unfurling in the light of a small yellow star, suitable for the historical record and for silencing, permanently, any cataloger inclined to reopen old footnotes. He got instead 11 minutes. The 3rd and 5th battle groups crossed the threshold of cislunar space at 1140 Fleet Standard, 940 ships in tight formation, beacon tender at the center of the formation like a jewel in a fist, and it was at 11:51, 11 minutes after the formation crossed into the volume of space, the Sol survey's uncatalogued 11% had once occupied, that every passive sensor on every one of those 940 ships registered. In the same instant, across a spherical volume nearly 400,000 kilometers in diameter, the dark matter shroud fall. It did not fall gradually. It did not fade or thin or give any of the courteous warning a combined sensor officer might have expected from an honest malfunction. One moment the volume of space surrounding the 3rd and 5th battle groups on every axis was, by every instrument aboard every ship, empty. The next moment it was not, and the difference between those two moments was so total, so instantaneous, and so far beyond anything in any combine engagement doctrine, that for a full 3 seconds logged later, on every surviving bridge recorder as 3 seconds of total silence, not one officer in either battle group gave a single order. 1,140 ships. That was the number that resolved on every tactical display in the span of that silence, arrayed not in a defensive crouch, but in the unhurried geometric precision of a force that had rehearsed this exact moment more times than any of its crews could easily count, wedge-hulled dreadnoughts with plating the color of a starless sky. Hulls scarred and pitted with the particular weathering of vessels that had sat, powered low, in hard vacuum for years rather than months. Engines glowing a deep banked orange along their flanks like coals under ash. They did not look new. They did not look ceremonial. They looked, to every trained eye on every combine bridge, like machines that had been waiting, patiently, purpose-built and long rehearsed, for exactly this. Aboard the flagship of the newly revealed fleet, a vessel whose own crew called her, with the particular dry affection warships earned from the people who live inside them, the Longwatch, Commodore Naomi Voss, watched the tactical plot bloom with 940 combine contacts, frozen in the stunned geometry of a formation that had just realized it was surrounded, and gave the order she had spent 11 years preparing to give. Open a channel, all combine vessels, all frequencies, and copy it to the threshold Accord's emergency relay. I want the Council hearing this in real time, not in an after-action report filtered through the Overseer's office. Her communications officer, a young lieutenant named Priya Adami, who had joined the Longwatch Fleet straight out of officer training, and had never, in 3 years of service, transmitted a word to anyone outside the fleet's own hulls, opened the channel with hands that were, very slightly, not quite steady. Channel open, Commodore, combined fleet-wide. Accord emergency relay confirmed receiving. Naomi Voss did not raise her voice. She had learned over 11 years that the quietest voice in the room carried the farthest when the room had just watched something it could not explain happen all around it. 3rd and 5th battle groups of the Volt Combine, she said. This is Commodore Naomi Voss, Longwatch Fleet, Sol Defense Command. You have entered the sovereign space of an inhabited world under armed escort to plant a claim beacon your own laws would call an act of war if any fleet attempted it against one of your own systems. You will reverse course, withdraw from cislunar space, and transmit your intention to do so within 90 seconds, or this fleet will consider the beacon laying an act of invasion and will respond accordingly. 400 light-years away, in a threshold Accord chamber that had reconvened for an unrelated procedural matter and found itself, without warning, listening to a live transmission relayed from the middle of what every instrument confirmed was an active fleet engagement. High Arbiter Petrus Vall sat very still, and beside him in the archivist's gallery, Iliot Sorn felt the cold finger of doubt she had carried since page 406 of Cato Ram's uncatalogued footnote turn, in the space of a single transmitted sentence, into something closer to vertigo. Sol Defense Command, Longwatch Fleet, words that appeared in no registry, no survey, no renewal she had ever signed, spoken by a voice that had just addressed 940 warships of the most powerful military force in the region as though they were, at best, an inconvenience. Overseer Rin Caldry in the Combine's gallery rose to her feet with something that was not quite composure anymore. This is a fabrication, she said, to no one in particular and to the whole chamber at once. There is no registry entry. There is no possible origin for a fleet of that size inside a system this Accord's own survey confirms was Was what, Overseer? Iliad said, and was surprised even as she said it by how level her own voice came out. Confirmed how? By whom? On what data? Gathered from what percentage of the volume? Caldry did not answer, because there was no answer that did not require admitting, in front of the full chamber and the Combine's own recording archive, that the 11% Kato RAM had flagged, and no one had ever resurveyed was, at this exact moment, resolving itself into 1,140 warships that had apparently been sitting there, patiently, waiting for someone to be foolish enough to bring a claim beacon within range. Aboard the flagship of the 3rd Battle Group, Marshal Cass's second-in-command, a hard, capable officer named Vice Marshal Asa Trell, who had earned her rank putting down 3 separate frontier rebellions, and had never once in that career faced a force she could not immediately outgun, did the arithmetic on her own tactical display, and did not like the answer it gave her. 940 Combine hulls, caught in transit formation rather than combat posture, surrounded on every axis by 1,140 vessels whose weapon signatures, now spooling visibly on every one of their forward hardpoints, a slow gathering bloom of energy that read, on Combine targeting sensors, as something closer to a controlled singularity than any railgun or beam weapon in the Combine's own arsenal, suggested very strongly that the 90 seconds Commodore Voss had offered were not a bluff. Vice Marshal, said her own communications officer, 90 seconds are almost up. Do we withdraw? Trell looked at the frozen tactical plot, at the beacon tender sitting exposed at the heart of a formation that had believed itself, an hour earlier, to be escorting a ceremony rather than provoking a war, and made the decision that would be studied afterward in every surviving Combine Staff College as the correct call made 11 seconds too late. Signal Marshal Cass for authorization to withdraw, she said. Immediately. We do not have discretion to. She did not finish the sentence, because at that moment the 90 seconds ran out. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds, and it ended the war for 118 combined ships before Vice Marshal Trell's authorization request had even finished transmitting to Marshal Cass's flagship 2 light seconds distant. It was not a barrage in the way Combine doctrine understood barrages. No massed volley, no ranging shots, no visible buildup beyond the slow gathering bloom that Combine sensors had already flagged as a weapon signature they could not classify. What happened instead was that 118 separate points of light appeared simultaneously at 118 separate coordinates across the 3rd and 5th Battle Group's formation, and where each point of light appeared, a Combine warship simply stopped existing as a coherent object. Not an explosion in the ordinary sense, no expanding fireball, no debris cloud with the leisurely physics of conventional destruction, but a compression, hull and crew and cargo folding inward toward a point smaller than a fist in a fraction of a second too small for any bridge recorder to resolve into more than a single frame of white light followed by absence. Aboard Marshal Cass's flagship, 2 light seconds back from the engagement, and receiving the tactical feed with the small, cruel delay that distance imposed even at the speed of information, the display resolved 118 ship icons into red haze in the time it took Cass to draw one breath. Belay the withdrawal order, he said, though no one had given him the chance to countermand it before it happened. Bring up the 2nd and 4th groups. Full commitment. I want every hull we have in Sol space converging on that formation within the hour. It was the order of a man who still, even watching 118 ships vanish in 4 seconds, could not quite make the arithmetic in front of him mean what it plainly meant. He had 11,400 vessels committed to this campaign. He had watched them destroy 41 obsolete human hulls in 4 minutes without taking a scratch. The idea that a single opposing fleet, however strange its weapons, however impossible its concealment, might actually be capable of matching that scale of force sat, in Marshal Dreth Cass's mind, in the same category as an instrument fault, an anomaly to be corrected by the application of sufficient additional force, not a fact to be believed on its own terms. He would spend the next 52 minutes discovering, in increments too fast for correction, exactly how wrong that instinct was. The second and fourth battle groups, 4,100 ships, the largest single formation the Combine had committed to any engagement in 3 decades, broke from their staging positions in the outer belt and burned hard for cislunar space, arriving at the edge of the engagement zone 19 minutes later to find the third and fifth groups no longer a formation in any meaningful sense, but a scattered, burning debris field with survivors fighting in 2s and 3s against an enemy that moved. By every sensor reading the incoming reinforcements could gather, in ways that made no aerodynamic or inertial sense at all. It was Ensign Tavi Korsh, attached now to the second group's lead cruiser, having transferred forward from Raven's flotilla 3 days earlier at his own request, driven by an unease he still could not fully articulate, who got the clearest scan of a Longwatch dreadnought at close range, and who would later describe the reading, in the inquiry that followed, as the moment he stopped believing anything the Sol survey had ever told him. The ship read as faster in its turns and reversals than anything with its mass should be capable of, accelerations that should have crushed a human crew against their restraints hard enough to end them, sustained for durations that made no sense for any propulsion system the Combine's engineers could theorize from the emission signature. And yet the mass reading, when Korsh finally got a clean lock, came back absurd. The ship registered, in the instant his sensors resolved it, at a density nearly half again what its hull volume should allow for any known alloy, as though some of what filled that hull was not matter in the ordinary sense at all, but something heavier, stranger, borrowed from the same dark, unlit mass that made up most of the universe and was never meant to be gathered, refined, and wrapped around a warship's frame. "Command," Korsh said, and his voice on the recording did not sound like the voice of a man reading numbers off a screen. "I don't think their armor is armor. I think it's dark matter. I think they figured out how to hold it and shape it and put it on a hull." No one on the bridge answered him, because at that exact moment the cruiser he was standing on took a hit from a weapon that did to 60% of its forward mass exactly what the first volley had done to the 118 ships an hour earlier. And Tavi Korsh spent the next several minutes doing the considerably more urgent work of keeping his own section of the ship pressurized rather than finishing the thought. The engagement that followed, logged afterward by the handful of Combine officers who survived long enough to file reports as the Sol reversal, and studied for decades after by every military academy in the region under names considerably less clinical, did not resemble, in any particular, the confident occupation Marshal Koss had ordered 11 hours earlier. The Longwatch Fleet fought the way its name suggested it had been built to fight, without haste, without the urgency of a force worried about running out of anything, converging on isolated Combine formations with the unhurried precision of a species that had spent years rehearsing exactly this scenario in simulation, and found, now that the moment had finally arrived, that reality matched the rehearsal closely enough not to require improvisation. Commodore Voss did not, in the entire 52 minutes of the engagement's most intense phase, raise her voice once. She gave orders in the flat, economical cadence of someone reciting a checklist she had memorized years earlier, and around her the Longwatch's bridge crew, young, almost uniformly young. The oldest officer on that bridge, barely past 40, executed each order with the particular calm of people who had trained for this exact day so many times that the day itself, now that it had come, felt almost anticlimactic. "Second group is breaking formation," reported her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered lieutenant commander named Diego Fabry. "They're trying to concentrate fire on the Halloway and the Ashworth." "Let them try," Voss said. "Diego, hold the Halloway and Ashworth shield rotation on my mark, and have the Cortez and the Wren swing wide to their flank." I want the second group to feel surrounded before they finish concentrating." It took 11 more minutes for the second battle group to lose cohesion entirely, its ships scattering into individual retreats that the Longwatch Fleet, with the same unhurried precision, ran down one by one rather than pursuing en masse. A deliberate choice. Voss would explain afterward in the debrief that every surviving officer aboard the Longwatch attended, because a fleeing enemy who believed escape was possible fought less desperately, and died less expensively for both sides, than one who believed there was nothing left to lose. The fourth battle group fared marginally better, if 51 minutes of sustained losses against a fleet that never once took a hull-critical hit in return could be called faring better at all. Its commander, a cautious, methodical officer named Rear Admiral Oyelaren Kess, recognized the shape of the disaster faster than most of her peers and ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the belt rather than a continued advance, a decision that cost her formation 411 ships instead of the near-total losses suffered by the second and third groups, and that would, in the after-action assessments the Combine conducted in the following months, be held up as the single competent tactical decision made by anyone on the Combine side in the entire engagement. It was not enough to change the arithmetic. By the 52nd minute of the engagement, measured precisely, from the moment the 90-second ultimatum expired to the moment Marshal Koss finally gave the order every surviving officer under his command had been waiting, in some cases begging silently, to hear. The Combine's committed forces at Sol had gone from 11,400 vessels to a number small enough that Koss's own tactical staff, reading it off the display, initially assumed a data error. 2,309 ships remained in any condition to fight, retreat, or transmit. Koss stared at that number for 11 full seconds, the same 11 seconds, though no one on his bridge would ever know the coincidence, that had first cracked open the shroud a lifetime and a half a day earlier, and then gave the order that Vice Marshal Trell had been trying to get authorized since the engagement's opening minute. "All remaining forces," he said, and his voice, for the first time in the entire campaign, did not sound like the voice of a man closing out a successful annexation. "Full withdrawal, every ship still capable of a burn, out of the system now." The order came too late for roughly half the ships still capable of receiving it, which was, by that point in the engagement, the shape of nearly everything Marshal Koss attempted. The Longwatch Fleet did not oppose the withdrawal with the same unhurried methodical destruction it had applied to the advance. Commodore Voss had given explicit orders, transmitted fleet-wide the instant Koss's withdrawal broadcast registered on her own sensors, that any Combine vessel making a genuine, verifiable burn away from Sol space was to be allowed to go, but verifiable took time to confirm. And in a fleet as large and as thoroughly broken as the Combine's remaining 2,309 ships, not every captain managed to convince a Longwatch targeting system of their sincerity before the window for restraint expired. Vice Marshal Trell made it out. So did Rear Admiral Kess's disciplined remnant of the fourth group, which reached the system's edge with 411 ships still under her command, and did not lose a single additional hull in the retreat, a fact she would cite, for the rest of her career, as proof that discipline mattered even in a battle already lost. Ensign Tavi Korsh made it out too, aboard a cruiser missing 60% of its forward mass, having spent the retreat's final 20 minutes doing structural triage in a section of hull that should, by any reasonable engineering standard, have killed everyone aboard it an hour earlier. Marshal Drethkos did not make it out. His flagship, the Combine's largest committed hull and the campaign's designated command vessel, had been positioned 2 light seconds back from the engagement for exactly the reason command vessels always were: distance, and the presumption of safety that distance implied. It was a presumption built on the assumption that any opposing force capable of reaching a flagship at all would need time and warning, and a slow, methodical advance through the layers of escort that surrounded it. The Longwatch Fleet needed none of those things. Naomi Voss had held 4 dreadnoughts in reserve for the entire 52 minutes of the main engagement. The Cassion, the Voskualen, the Idris, and her own flagship sister hull, the Solace, not committed to any of the running battles against the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th battle groups, and not because she had expected to need them for those fights. She had held them back because a campaign this large, run by a marshal this experienced, would have a command vessel sitting somewhere behind the front line, and she had promised herself, 11 years earlier, that the day the Longwatch Fleet finally revealed itself, it would end with more than a tactical victory. It would end with a message specific enough that no future overseer, no future marshal, no future threshold accord committee renewing a survey out of clerical habit, could mistake what had happened at Saul for an accident of scale rather than a deliberate demonstration of exactly how thoroughly the old assessment had been wrong. The 4 reserve dreadnoughts crossed 2 light seconds of space in 9 minutes, an acceleration profile that, when Trell's surviving staff reconstructed it afterward from wreckage telemetry, produced numbers no one at the inquiry believed until 3 independent engineering teams confirmed them separately, and arrived at Marshal Koss's flagship's position with the same unhurried, rehearsed precision that had characterized every other minute of the engagement. Koss had 11 escort cruisers screening his flagship. They lasted, against 4 Longwatch dreadnoughts operating in coordinated formation, fractionally longer than the 118 ships in the engagement's opening volley, 9 seconds instead of 4, which was, in the flat later judgment of the Combine's own inquiry board, a testament to nothing except the fact that 11 ships take marginally longer to destroy than 118 when the destroying force is only 4 hulls rather than the full fleet. Aboard the Longwatch, Naomi Voss watched the flagship's shields fail on her tactical display, watched the ship's own emergency broadcast, an automated distress signal, not a voice, because by that point there had been no one left on Koss's bridge with the composure to speak, begin transmitting on the Combine's fleet frequency, and gave the order that ended the Saul reversal's final and most consequential engagement. "Hold fire," she said. "Diego, get a boarding team ready. I want the Marshal alive if he's alive, and I want the Accord to have proof of exactly whose authorization sent 11,400 ships into a system they never actually surveyed." Marshal Drethkoss was, in fact, alive when the boarding team from the Cassion reached his flagship's shattered command deck 11 minutes later, badly injured, 3 ribs broken against a restraint harness that had done its job imperfectly during the flagship's final violent maneuvers, but alive, and lucid enough, when a young Longwatch lieutenant offered him medical treatment in a language his own ship's translator rendered without difficulty. To understand exactly what had happened to the campaign, he had launched with such confidence 8 days earlier. He said one thing to the boarding officer before the medical team sedated him for transport, and it was recorded, and it would be quoted, in the Accord's inquiry, in the histories written afterward, in every version of the story that eventually made its way back to a home system that had spent a century and a half believing itself catalogued, understood, and safely dismissed. "The file said you were powerless," he said. "The file was signed." The young lieutenant, whose name was Marcus Webb and who was 24 years old and had joined the Longwatch Fleet straight out of a childhood spent hearing his grandparents tell stories about exactly this day, looked down at the Marshal with an expression that held considerably less triumph in it than Koss might have expected. "The file was wrong," Webb said. "It was always going to be wrong eventually. We just made sure it stayed wrong long enough to matter." 400 light-years away, in a chamber that had not adjourned in 11 hours because no one, not the arbiter, not the assembled delegates, not Overseer Rin Caldry, who sat now with her 4 hands unfolded, and still, for the first time anyone in the gallery could remember, could bring themselves to leave before the relay feed finished delivering its final numbers. Iliot Sorn watched the engagement's tally resolve on the display ring above the chamber floor, and felt the vertigo that had been building in her chest, since the moment Naomi Voss's ultimatum first interrupted the session finally settle into something colder and more permanent. Not surprise anymore, but grief for a mistake that had already, irreversibly, been made. 11,400 vessels committed. 206 vessels ultimately returned to Combine space under their own power or under escort. Every other ship, and the greater part of every crew aboard them, lost in a single engagement that had lasted, from the ultimatum's expiration to Marshal Koss's capture, 52 minutes. High Arbiter Petrus Vall read the final tally into the chamber's permanent record himself, his voice carrying none of the measured authority it had held 11 hours earlier when he pronounced humanity powerless. And when he finished, he did something Iliot had never once, in 22 years of service to the Threshold Accord, seen a sitting arbiter do in open session. He turned from the podium and looked directly at her. "Adjunct Sorn," he said, "you proposed a resurvey be scheduled at standard priority once current operations concluded. Current operations have concluded. I am revising that instruction. You will lead a full resurvey of the Sol system at the Accord's highest priority, and you will begin as soon as the Sol Defense Command is willing to permit Accord vessels back into the system they have just, at extraordinary cost to themselves, finished defending." It was, Iliot understood, both an apology and a sentence. An acknowledgment that the mistake had been institutional rather than personal, wrapped inside an assignment that would require her to spend however many years it took looking, honestly this time, at everything the Accord had spent a century and a half refusing to see. She stood at the archivist's podium, in a chamber gone very quiet around her, and found that, for the first time since the vote had passed 11 hours earlier, the cold feeling in her chest had nowhere left to climb. "Yes, Arbiter," she said, "I'll begin immediately." The Sol reversal, as the engagement came to be known within a matter of days across every network the Threshold Accord maintained, did not end the crisis. It only changed its shape. Word reached Combine home space 11 hours after the last surviving ship of Koss's shattered command cleared the system's edge, carried by Vice Marshal Trell's own personal transmission rather than any official channel, because Trell had judged, correctly, as it turned out, that the Combine's civilian leadership would need to hear the numbers from someone who had watched them happen before the inevitable attempts to soften them in transit through the chain of command. The reaction, in the Combine's Central War Ministry, split almost immediately into two irreconcilable factions, and the split ran, uncomfortably, straight through the middle of Overseer Rin Caldry's own office. 11,400 ships, said Fleet Minister Osk Barath, a broad, humorless administrator who had spent 30 years building the Combine's military procurement apparatus into the largest in the region, slamming one of his 4 hands flat against his desk hard enough to rattle the small ornamental stones arranged along its edge. "We do not survive as a power in this region if the story that spreads is that a single system with a fleet no one has ever heard of destroyed the largest force we have committed to any campaign in 30 years, and we simply accepted it. Every rival claim we hold, every contested border, every tributary system watching to see how we respond, they will all draw the same conclusion. We commit the full mobilization reserve. 40,000 ships. We end this the way it should have ended the first time." 40,000 ships, said Overseer Caldry, and there was something in her voice that had not been there 11 hours ago in the chamber, when she had called Iliot Sorn's diligence an insult with 4 folded hands and perfect composure. "Minister, I watched the relay feed from the Accord chamber. I watched a single fleet destroy 11,400 of our ships in 52 minutes without losing a single hull of its own that anyone has been able to confirm. I do not know what 40,000 ships accomplishes against a force that has already demonstrated it does not need to fight fair to win, except demonstrate, at considerably greater cost, exactly how thoroughly we still do not understand what we are dealing with. Then we learn what we are dealing with, Bareth said. We do not simply walk away from Saul because one engagement went badly. That is not how the Combine holds a border, Overseer. It has never been how we hold a border. It was, Iliot Sorn would reflect much later, the exact same failure of imagination that had produced the original vote. The assumption that a bad outcome was an anomaly to be corrected by scale, rather than a signal to be understood on its own terms. And it was disturbing, watching the relay feed of the Combine's internal deliberations that the Accord's own intelligence office had managed to intercept within a day of the engagement's end. How little the disaster at Saul had actually taught the people who had ordered it. 40,000 ships was not a number the Threshold Accord could simply watch assemble without comment, whatever the legal boundaries of its own authority over a member state's military decisions, and it was High Arbiter Vol himself, invoking, for the first time in his 11 years as presiding arbiter, an emergency mediation clause that had not been used in over a century, who summoned both Overseer Caldry and, through the same emergency relay channel that had carried Commodore Voss's ultimatum 11 days earlier, a representative of Saul Defense Command, to a session that the Accord's own charter classified as binding. Naomi Voss did not attend that session in person, and would not have been able to reach the Accord's home system in the time available even if she had wanted to. She sent, instead, a recorded statement, transmitted through the same relay and played into the chamber at the appointed hour with a formality that made the Combine's fleet minister visibly uncomfortable in his seat. To the Threshold Accord and to the Volt Combine's War Ministry, the recording began, Voss's voice carrying the same flat, unhurried economy it had carried during the engagement itself. I understand that a further mobilization is under consideration. I want to be direct about what that mobilization would encounter, because I would rather this crisis end with an accurate accounting than with a second engagement neither side actually needs to fight. The display ring above the chamber floor resolved, as she spoke, into a tactical projection that made the Accord's own defense analysts, 3 of whom had spent the intervening days trying and failing to model the Longwatch Fleet's true capability from the wreckage data alone, sit forward in their seats. The force that engaged the 3rd, 4th, and 5th battle groups 11 days ago was one picket fleet, assigned to one approach vector into Saul space, out of 11 such pickets currently deployed around the system's full perimeter. It represents, in total ship count, approximately 9% of Saul Defense Command's committed strength. I am not telling you this to provoke a larger mobilization. I am telling you this because Fleet Minister Bareth's 40,000 ships, whatever their intent, will not be entering a system defended by the force you fought 11 days ago. They will be entering a system defended by considerably more than that, and I would prefer, genuinely prefer, that no one on either side has to find out exactly how much more the hard way. The chamber was silent for a long moment after the recording ended. It was Iliot Sorn, from the archivist's gallery, who finally spoke, not because it was her place to address the assembled war ministers and overseers as an equal, but because 11 days of frantic resurvey work, conducted with an Accord research vessel granted grudging, closely escorted access to the outer edges of Saul space, had given her data that made the Commodore's recorded statement considerably harder to dismiss as bluff. Arbiter, if I may, she said, and Vol, who had learned in the 11 days since the engagement to take her interruptions considerably more seriously than he once had, nodded for her to continue. My survey team has, in the past 6 days, confirmed dark matter shroud signatures, consistent with the technology demonstrated in the engagement, at the outer edges of 4 additional systems within 18 light-years of Saul, all previously catalogued, on the strength of surveys no more thorough than the one I inherited, as uninhabited or resource negligible. I want to be careful about the conclusion I draw from 4 data points, but I do not think Commodore Voss's statement is bluff. I think it may, if anything, be conservative. Fleet Minister Barath's 40,000 ships did not, in the end, mobilize. It was not Iliot's testimony alone that stopped them, nor Voss's recorded warning, nor even the sober arithmetic of Overseer Caldry's own private calculations. It was, in the final accounting that historians would spend decades reconstructing from the Combine's own internal records, a quieter and more decisive fact. That within 72 hours of Voss's statement being played into the Accord chamber, 3 more member systems of the Threshold Accord, entirely unprompted, filed emergency requests for their own century-old surveys to be reopened, and 2 of them, smaller, more distant, catalogued even more cursorily than Saul had ever been, returned within days, their own unexplained censor gaps. The Combine's War Ministry, faced with the prospect that Saul might not be an isolated anomaly, but the visible edge of something considerably larger and older than anyone in the region had accounted for, chose, over Minister Barath's furious, eventually career-ending objections, to stand the mobilization down. It took another 6 weeks for the Threshold Accord and the Volt Combine to negotiate what both sides, with the particular caution of institutions that had just been badly humiliated, agreed to call a framework of recognition rather than a treaty, a distinction that mattered a great deal to Overseer Caldry's diplomatic staff and very little, as far as Iliot Sorn could tell, to anyone actually living through the consequences of what the framework was designed to manage. Saul's status was formally revised from open resource territory to sovereign contested space, a designation with almost no precedent in Accord law, requiring 3 separate committees to determine what obligations it actually imposed on either side. Marshal Koss, healed enough to travel but stripped of every rank and honor the Combine's War Ministry had ever granted him, was returned to Combine custody in a prisoner exchange that made front-page relay traffic across 40 systems, and that he would spend the remainder of a considerably diminished career trying, without much success, to explain in terms that did not sound like an excuse. And Iliot Sorn, 6 weeks and 1 very long series of committee hearings after High Arbiter Val had assigned her the resurvey at the Accord's highest priority, received something she had not expected to receive at all. An invitation, transmitted through Saul Defense Command's own diplomatic office rather than the Accord's, to conduct her survey work from inside the system itself, aboard an escort vessel provided by the very fleet whose existence her own negligence had helped conceal for a century and a half. She said yes before she had fully finished reading the message. The escort vessel that met her Accord research ship at the edge of Saul space was smaller than the Longwatch, sleeker, built along different lines. A courier-class hull, she would learn later, designed for exactly this kind of diplomatic ferrying rather than combat, but it was crude, she noted as she boarded through an airlock built to a human scale that made her own multi-jointed frame fold awkwardly to pass through, by people who moved with the same unhurried, rehearsed calm she had watched weeks earlier on the recorded bridge footage of the engagement itself. The officer who met her at the airlock introduced herself as Lieutenant Commander Priya Adami, the same communications officer, Iliot realized with a small jolt, whose voice she had heard on the emergency relay confirming the channel was open, back in the moment before everything changed, and escorted her, without any particular ceremony, to an observation deck near the courier's bow. "The Commodore thought you'd want to see this before the formal briefing," Adami said. "Most Accord officials ask for numbers first." She said you struck her as someone who'd want the numbers to mean something before you heard them. Iliot did not entirely understand what she meant until the courier cleared the edge of the asteroid field that had, for a century and a half, marked the boundary of everything the Sol survey claimed to know about its own system, and the observation deck's viewport resolved, out of the ordinary scattered dark of open space, into something that made her stop breathing for a moment she was faintly embarrassed by afterward. They were arrayed in loose formation across a volume of space so large that her mind, accustomed to reading tactical plots as abstract icons on a display ring, initially failed to process what her own eyes were showing her as a single coherent scene. Hundreds of hulls, she would learn later in the formal briefing, that the visible group numbered 411, a fraction of the fleet still on station even after the second and third groups had rotated home for maintenance, wedge-shaped and dark, running lights banked low, engines glowing that same deep coal orange she had seen in the wreckage recordings, sitting in the vast quiet dark past the ninth planet like something that had always been there and simply chosen, until now, not to be seen. "There's more," Adami said, watching her face rather than the view. "This is one picket group. There are 10 more like it around the system's perimeter, and behind them, further out, there's the reserve fleet and the shipyards and, well, you'll get the numbers in the briefing. I just wanted you to see it first. It's different seeing it. Everyone says so." "How long," Iliad said, when she trusted her voice again, "has this been here?" "The oldest hulls in that formation were laid down about 130 years ago," Adami said. "Give or take, about 15 years after your survey team's last visit." 130 years. Iliad did the arithmetic without needing to reach for a display. 15 years after Kato Ram's expedition filed its cursory, unsuspecting report, humanity had begun, deliberately and in near total secrecy, building a fleet large enough to annihilate the largest force the region's dominant military power could commit to a single campaign, and had gone on building, and rehearsing, and waiting, for 115 years after that, while every renewal of the file Iliad had inherited quietly reconfirmed a threat classification of null. "Why?" she asked, and heard in her own voice something that was not quite accusation and not quite grief but sat somewhere close to both. "Why wait so long? If you had this, if you'd had even a fraction of this for a century, why let the file stand? Why not simply tell us?" It was Commodore Voss herself who answered that question, 20 minutes later, when Iliad was shown into a briefing room aboard the courier, and found the Commodore waiting for her. A compact, unhurried woman who looked, Iliad thought, considerably younger than the weight of the last 11 days should have allowed, with the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation as carefully as she had rehearsed the engagement itself. "Because a species that reveals a fleet like this one before it needs to gets treated as a threat first and a neighbor never," Voss said. "We know that lesson. We learned it the hard way, a long time before your survey ever reached us, from our own history, one group finding another and deciding, on the strength of what it could see rather than what was actually there, that the other side was harmless enough to move against without consequence. We built this fleet so that mistake could never be made against us again. And then we made a choice, deliberately, generation after generation, to let it sit unused, because the alternative, announcing ourselves, demanding recognition, forcing the Accord to treat us as a power before we'd given anyone reason to fear us unprovoked, would have made us exactly the kind of threat the old file wrongly said we already were. So you waited," Iliad said, "for someone to make the mistake first." "We hoped no one would," Voss said, and for the first time in the conversation, something in her flat, economical voice shifted, just slightly, into something with more weight behind it. 11 years I've commanded a fleet built entirely around the hope that we'd never need to use it for exactly what it was built for. I'm not going to pretend I'm glad the vote passed the way it did, Adjunct Sorn. I'd have been considerably happier spending the rest of my career running drills against an enemy that never showed up. But your Accord read a 141-year-old file into the permanent record and used it to authorize an armed invasion of an inhabited system, and somewhere between the file being wrong and 11,400 ships crossing our border, waiting stopped being an option. Iliot sat with that for a long moment, looking past the Commodore's shoulder at the small viewport set into the briefing room's outer wall, through which she could still see, faint and distant, the edge of the formation she had watched resolve out of the dark 20 minutes earlier. "I signed that file 11 times, she said finally. "I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I want you to know that I understand exactly what it cost and whose hand was on the pen." Naomi Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression Iliot could not entirely read, something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite absolution, but was not condemnation either. "You're the first Accord official who said that to me without being asked to," Voss said. "For what it's worth, most people spend the apology explaining why it wasn't really their fault. Let's start the briefing. You came a long way to get real numbers instead of a footnote nobody read. I'd rather you left with those." The briefing lasted 4 hours, and Iliot Sorn would spend the rest of her career telling colleagues, in the dry, careful language of someone who had learned not to overstate a finding, that no single document in Accord history had ever revised so much of what the region believed about itself in so short a span of time. Sol Defense Command, Voss explained, was not a fleet built around one system. It was the visible forward edge of a defense network that extended, in varying degrees of concealment, across 19 star systems within a 60 light-year radius of Sol. Colonies established quietly over the past century and a half, some in systems the Accord's own survey listed as entirely uninhabited, others tucked into the unsurveyed margins of systems the Accord believed it already knew. The total number of hulls under Sol Defense Command's authority, Voss said, watching Iliot's face as she said it with the particular care of someone delivering a number she expected to be genuinely difficult to hear, stood at 41,260 warships, the smallest of them comparable in tonnage to the Longwatch pickets that had engaged the Combine at Sol. The largest, a reserve-class Voss referred to only as the deep hulls, and declined, even in that briefing, to describe in further detail. Built for a purpose, she was not yet willing to explain to anyone outside her own chain of command. 41,000, Iliot said, and found that after 4 hours of increasingly large numbers, her capacity for further shock had worn down to something closer to numb, careful arithmetic. The Combine committed 11,400 to the Sol campaign. You're telling me that represented less than a third of what Sol Defense Command alone could field, without drawing on whatever the deep holes are. "I'm telling you," Voss said, "that if the Combine had committed its full mobilization reserve, the 40,000 ships Minister Barrett wanted to send, it would still have been outnumbered by the forces already on station in this system alone, before a single additional hull moved from any of the other 18 colonies. I want to be careful here, Adjunct Sorn, because I don't want this briefing used as a threat. It's not intended as one, but you asked for the numbers, and the numbers are the numbers." Iliot thought, sitting in that briefing room with the true scale of a century and a half of quiet, patient, deliberately unrevealed human expansion laid out in front of her, of the summary page she had read on her first day as adjunct cataloger, population, scattered, agrarian remnants and isolated industrial pockets, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite awe settle into the same permanent place in her chest where the vertigo had been living since the vote first passed. "I have to ask," she said, "not as an accusation, as a cataloger trying to understand what I'm looking at. If the Combine's 40,000 ships would still have lost decisively, without the deep hulls even engaging, why did the engagement at Sol only involve a fraction of a single picket group? Why not simply show the Combine's advance fleet the scale of what they were actually facing, the moment they crossed the border, and let the numbers alone end it without a shot fired?" It was Lieutenant Commander Adami, standing at the back of the briefing room, who answered before Voss could. Because showing someone your whole hand doesn't teach them anything, Adami said. The Combine needed to actually lose ships to believe the file was wrong. If we just lit up 41,000 hulls on their sensors the moment they crossed the border, half their war ministry would have called it a projection, a bluff, an illusion generated to scare them off, and Minister Bharat's 40,000 would have launched anyway, this time against a system that had shown its full strength and had nowhere left to go if the bluff got called. Showing restraint, and then showing exactly enough force to make the lesson land, cost fewer lives on both sides than showing everything would have. The Commodores spent 11 years planning for exactly that arithmetic. Voss did not add anything to that explanation, and Elliot understood, watching the two women exchange the brief, unspoken look of people who had discussed this exact question many times before in private, that it was not a decision either of them had made lightly or would ever describe as easy. The briefing's final hour turned, at Elliot's own request, from the fleet's scale to its history, not the tactical arithmetic of what Saul Defense Command could field, but the slower, quieter story of how a species the Accord survey described as building with stone and steel had spent a century and a half becoming something else entirely without a single member of the Accord noticing, and it was there in the last hour that Elliot finally understood the shape of the mistake she had spent 22 years unknowingly perpetuating. Kato Ram's survey had been accurate, as far as it went. Humanity, 145 years earlier, genuinely had possessed nothing beyond chemical rockets and low orbital capability, and Ram's fond, careful notes about cathedrals and long poems about small things had been an honest, even generous account of a species with very little to be stubborn about, exactly as he'd written. The failure was not in what Ram had seen. It was in the 11% he had flagged as unresolved, and no one, in 145 years and 11 renewals, had ever gone back to look at. The long, cold dark past the Ninth World where, 15 years after his visit, a species that had just watched enough of its own history to understand exactly what happened to peoples who were catalogued, dismissed, and left unprotected, had begun. Quietly and with a patience that made Elliot's own century of professional habit look almost childish by comparison, to build something the file would never think to look for because the file had already decided, on page 1, that there was nothing there worth looking for at all. "We didn't build this because we hated anyone," Voss said, near the end of the briefing, in a voice that had gone quieter than anything else she'd said in 4 hours. "We built it because we'd read our own history closely enough to know what happens to a people who get caught unprepared by someone who's already decided what they're worth before bothering to actually look. I'd have been glad, genuinely glad, to spend the rest of my life proving that fear wrong. The Accord's file made sure I didn't get the chance." Elliot left the briefing room 4 hours after entering it, and stood for a long while afterward at the small viewport in the courier's forward corridor, looking out at the dark edge of the formation still visible past the Ninth World's faint curve, and did not, for once in her long, careful career, reach for a data pad to begin drafting the report she already knew would take months to write and years to be fully believed. She was still standing there, 20 minutes later, when the courier's proximity alarm sounded for the first time since she had come aboard. A soft, insistent tone that brought Lieutenant Commander Adami hurrying past her toward the bridge with an expression that had lost, in the space of 3 seconds, every trace of the calm hospitality she had shown Elliot all afternoon. "Contact," Adami said, into a comm unit Elliot hadn't noticed her raise. "Small craft, unregistered transponder approaching the picket perimeter from the system's edge. Profile doesn't match anything in the Combine's confirmed order of battle. 400 meters aft, on the bridge of the picket flagship that had, 40 minutes earlier, hosted the largest single disclosure of classified military strength in Saul Defense Command's history. Commodore Naomi Voss looked at the same contact resolving on her own tactical display, and felt the particular, familiar cold settle into her shoulders that told her, before a single weapon had been fired. That the 6 weeks of careful diplomacy since the Sol reversal were about to be tested by someone who had not gotten the message the first time. The craft was small, a single vessel, barely larger than the courier that had carried Iliad into the system that morning, and it was moving, according to the Pickett's sensors, on a burn profile that made no sense for a diplomatic approach or a reconnaissance sweep. It was accelerating, hard and without any of the deceleration curve a ship intending to make contact and stop would need to fly, directly toward the coordinates of the briefing courier. "Identify," Voss said, already moving toward her own tactical station. "Transponders dark," her sensor officer reported. "But the hull signature, Commodore, this matches the profile of a Combine deep penetration courier, Special Operations class. It's not part of any registered fleet movement we've been briefed on." Aboard the small ship itself, a Combine officer named Commander Yeva Rask sat alone at the controls, 3 hours into a mission that existed in no official record and had been authorized, if authorized was even the right word for what had actually happened, by a single encrypted transmission from Fleet Minister Osk Bareth 2 days before his formal removal from office had been finalized, a transmission that ordered her, in terms she had not fully understood until she reviewed the mission parameters a second time, to confirm by direct sensor contact whether the fleet that had destroyed 11,400 Combine ships was, in fact, as large as Commodore Voss's briefing claimed, or whether, as Bareth had insisted in his last days of authority to anyone who would still listen to him, the entire disclosure had been an elaborate deception, a projection or illusion staged to force a humiliating piece on a Combine that could, if it simply called the bluff, still win. Rask did not fully believe Bareth's theory. She had seen the wreckage footage from the Sol reversal, same as every other officer in the Combine's military, and did not think 11,400 ships could be destroyed by an illusion. But orders from a sitting fleet minister, even a fleet minister 2 days from removal, were orders, and Yeva Rask had built a 20-year career on the principle that a soldier who second-guessed every command she found personally implausible was not a soldier anyone could rely on. She was 3 minutes from what her mission parameters described, with a bluntness that made her faintly uneasy even now, as a close-range confirmation sensor sweep of the diplomatic courier's registered position, a maneuver that, at the speed and distance involved, would put her own small ship on a collision-adjacent trajectory that any defending force would be entitled, under any military doctrine in the region, to treat as a hostile attack run, when the space around her ship did. For the second time in 6 weeks, something that made every instrument aboard return numbers that should not have been possible. It did not announce itself with the same overwhelming spectacle as the Sol reversal's opening moment. There was no vast formation resolving out of the dark on every axis at once. There was, instead, one single ship, smaller than a Longwatch dreadnought, sleek and dark, its running lights entirely dimmed, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the void it emerged from except for a faint band of banked orange along its ventral hull, that simply appeared, at a range of 11 kilometers, directly ahead of her burn vector, without her sensors registering any approach, acceleration, or transition at all. It had not moved into position. It had, as far as any instrument aboard Rask's ship could determine, simply already been there, the entire time, close enough that her own reckless burn toward the courier would have carried her directly past its hull within another 90 seconds if it had not chosen, at that exact moment, to become visible. "Combined vessel," said a voice over her open channel, calm, unhurried, carrying no more urgency than if its speaker were reading a shipping manifest. "You are 11 kilometers from a diplomatic vessel under Sol Defense Command escort, on an intercept trajectory inconsistent with any registered flight plan. You will cut thrust and transmit your intentions within 30 seconds, or this vessel will conclude your intentions for you." Yeva Rask had spent 20 years training for exactly the kind of moment she now found herself in, and every part of that training told her, with a clarity that cut straight through Fleet Minister Bareth's discredited theory about illusions and projections, that the ship sitting 11 kilometers off her bow, small, dark, and utterly, silently unhurried, was not a bluff, and was not going to need 30 seconds to prove it. She cut thrust. She transmitted her registration, her unit designation, and a hastily improvised claim that her approach had been an unauthorized navigational error rather than what it plainly, obviously was, and she spent the 11 minutes it took for a Longwatch response craft to arrive, match her ship's course, and escort her at gunpoint back toward the picket perimeter for formal detention. Composing in her own mind the considerably more honest account she intended to give her interrogators once the pretense of navigational error became, as she already understood it would, impossible to sustain. Aboard the diplomatic courier, Elliot Sorn had watched the entire 11-minute encounter unfold on a secondary display in the forward corridor, patched through by a crew member who had, without being asked, made sure the Accord's visiting cataloger was not left standing in ignorance, while a potential attack ran its course 11 kilometers from her own position. She watched the single dark ship materialize out of nothing exactly the way the 1,140 ships of the main Longwatch picket had materialized 6 weeks earlier, watched the 30-second ultimatum expire without a single shot fired, watched the intercepted courier's engines cut, and its crew's hasty, obviously false explanation transmit across an open channel that every ship in the sector could hear. And she understood, watching it, something about the nature of the mistake her Accord had made that the 4-hour briefing had not, quite, made as concrete as this single small encounter did. That the file's failure had never really been about the size of what it missed. 1,140 ships or one single dark hull sitting silent 11 kilometers off an intruder's bow, the category of error was the same either way. A species that could conceal a fleet of 41,000 warships across 19 star systems for a century and a half could, with exactly the same discipline, conceal a single ship close enough to reach out and touch an intruder before the intruder's own sensors had any warning at all. The scale had never been the point. The discipline was the point, and the discipline had not wavered once, not for 130 years of secrecy, and not for the 11 minutes it had just taken to neutralize an unauthorized incursion without killing a single person aboard the ship that caused it. Commander Yeva Rask was returned to Combine custody 4 days later, along with a formal Accord protest regarding the incursion, and a considerably less formal private message from Commodore Voss to the Combine's newly appointed acting fleet minister, informing her that the incident had been logged, that no further action would be taken against a single officer who had, in Voss's own private assessment relayed through diplomatic channels, been following the last orders of a man already out of authority when he gave them, and that Saul Defense Command would consider the matter closed provided it did not recur. It did not recur. Fleet Minister Osk Bareth, stripped of his final honors within the week and quietly retired to a coastal estate on his homeworld, that the Combine's relay press covered with considerably more interest than his removal had originally attracted, gave no further public statements about illusions, projections, or bluffs, and the theory that had sent Yeva Rask on an unauthorized 11-kilometer collision course with a ship she could not see, until it chose to be seen did not, in the months that followed, find any new champions willing to test it a second time. The Combine's own military inquiry into the Saul campaign convened 7 weeks after the engagement, in a proceeding that the Combine's War Ministry had originally intended to keep closed to outside observers, and that eventually, under mounting pressure from 3 separate member systems of the Accord demanding transparency after their own survey gaps came to light, opened its record to a limited Accord observer delegation. Elliot Sorn was not formally part of that delegation. Her own resurvey work kept her occupied at Sol for most of the inquiry's duration, but she read every transcript the moment it became available, and it was in the third week of testimony that she found the passage that would stay with her longer than almost anything from her own direct experience of the crisis. Ensign Tavi Korsh, 26 years old, testified for just under 2 hours, and spent most of that testimony walking the inquiry board through the private log he had kept against every instinct his training had given him not to the anomalous return that appeared precisely 41 times in 6 days, the density reading half again too heavy for any known alloy. The moment, 30 seconds before his cruiser lost 60% of its forward mass, that he had said aloud on an open bridge channel that the Longwatch Fleet's armor was not armor at all, and had been answered by silence rather than argument because there had been no time left, by then, for anyone to argue with him. "Ensign Korsh," said the inquiry's presiding officer, a stern, precise vice-admiral named Tor Ashvin who had built her own reputation on exacting standards for sensor discipline, "you identified an anomaly on the first day of operations, and you continued privately tracking that anomaly for 6 days without formally reporting it up the chain of command. Why?" "Because I'd been told twice that it was a comet core or a debris shadow," Korsh said. "And because a 3-month ensign who tells his flotilla commander that the century-and-a-half-old survey underpinning the entire campaign has an unresolved gap in exactly the coordinates his own sensors keep flagging does not, in my experience of the chain of command, get taken seriously enough to change anything. I kept the log because I wanted a record that I'd seen it, even if nobody with the authority to act on it ever would. I did not expect that record to end up mattering. I expected it to end up in a drawer." "And when the engagement began," Ashvin said, "and your own analysis proved correct, what was your reaction?" Korsh was quiet for a moment before he answered, and the inquiry's own transcript noted, in the flat clinical language such records used, a pause of approximately 6 seconds. "I didn't feel vindicated, Admiral," he said finally. "I felt sick. I'd been right, and being right meant watching 118 ships disappear in 4 seconds, and knowing that if anyone above me had listened 3 days earlier, some of that might have been avoidable. Not the outcome. I don't think the outcome was ever avoidable once the fleet crossed that border. But the timing of it, the surprise of it, the fact that we walked into it with our formation still in transit posture instead of combat readiness. I don't think being right is something to be proud of, when the price of being right is watching it happen exactly the way you were afraid it would." The inquiry's final report, filed 4 months after the engagement, and running to 11,000 pages that almost no one outside the Combine's own military establishment would ever read in full, reached a conclusion that Elliot Sorn found, when she finally worked her way through its executive summary, both entirely predictable and still, somehow, difficult to absorb. That the Sol campaign had failed not because the Combine's forces had performed incompetently in the engagement itself, but because every layer of command above the level of a single anxious ensign had made the same institutional choice, over and over, to trust an old, unresolved document over the evidence directly in front of them. The same choice, in different uniforms and different chambers, that the Threshold Accord's own arbiter had made when he weighed a 145-year-old margin note against Overseer Caldry's confident dismissal and chose, in the end, the comfort of precedent. It was that conclusion, more than any tactical detail in the report, that shaped the recommendation Elliot ultimately submitted to the full Accord Assembly 6 months after the vote that had started everything. Not simply a corrected survey of Sol, though the corrected survey ran to 900 pages, and revised, in careful, exhaustive detail, every claim the old file had made, but a standing procedural reform requiring any survey older than 25 years, on any system anywhere within Accord jurisdiction, to be independently re-verified before it could serve as legal basis for any claim, armed or otherwise, against the system it described. The reform passed, after considerable debate, by a margin narrow enough that Elliot privately suspected it would not have passed at all if the memory of 11,400 lost ships had not still been so recent in every delegate's mind. She would spend the better part of the next decade, in one capacity or another, making sure that memory did not fade quickly enough for the reform to quietly lapse the way so many post-crisis reforms eventually did. She thought, more than once during those years, about the conversation she'd had aboard the diplomatic courier, the first Accord official who said that to me without being asked to, and found that she carried the exchange less as a wound than as a kind of compass. It was not enough, she had come to believe, to simply correct the one file that had happened to be wrong in a way that produced a war. The habit that had let the file stand unread for 145 years was the actual danger, and habits, unlike single documents, did not correct themselves simply because one catastrophic case forced a single revision. They had to be hunted down, deliberately and repeatedly, in every dusty renewal stamp and every clerical shortcut across the whole vast slow-moving apparatus of an institution built, like most institutions eventually became, around the comfortable assumption that yesterday's answer was probably still good enough for today's question. The formal treaty, the Accord's diplomats eventually abandoned the framework of recognition's careful evasions, and simply called it what it was signed 14 months after the Sol reversal, in a ceremony held, at Sol Defense Command's own quiet insistence, not in the grand chambers of the Threshold Accord's home system, but aboard a converted freight platform in Sol's own cislunar space, within sight of the same volume of dark where 1,140 warships had once waited, patiently and unseen, for a mistake that had eventually, inevitably arrived. Elliot stood at the edge of the freight platform's observation deck an hour before the ceremony was due to begin, watching the slow assembly of dignitaries from a dozen Accord member systems mingle with a smaller, more careful delegation from the Combine, and found herself, not for the first time in the 14 months since the vote, running the old file's language back through her mind like a wound she kept checking to see whether it had finally closed. Population, scattered, agrarian remnants, and isolated industrial pockets. She had read those words so many times in the exhausted weeks after the engagement that they no longer felt like Kato Ram's careful observation of a species doing its best with limited means. They felt now like the opening line of a story whose actual ending no one had bothered to read far enough to find. "You're doing the thing again," said a voice beside her, and Elliot turned to find Priya Adami, now formally a full commander, and Elliot had learned over the 14 months of their occasional, increasingly frank correspondence, one of Sol Defense Command's newly appointed liaison officers to the Accord, dressed for the ceremony in a formal uniform that still managed to look on her, faintly impatient with its own ceremony. "What thing?" "The thing where you stand somewhere quiet and reread the old file in your head like it's going to say something different this time." Adami's tone was gentle rather than mocking. "I've watched you do it 3 times today already. It doesn't get shorter, no matter how many times you run it." "No," Elliot admitted, "it doesn't." "For what it's worth," Adami said, "the Commodore doesn't hold it against you. I know that's not the same as it not mattering, but I thought you should hear it from someone other than her, because she'd never say it herself in so many words. She's not built that way, and honestly neither are most of us. We were raised on stories about what happens when you let your guard down around people who have already decided what you're worth. You didn't decide that about us personally. You inherited a decision somebody else made 140 years before you were even assigned the file. That's not nothing in her book. It's not everything either. But it's not nothing." Elliot did not have an answer for that which felt adequate, so she said nothing, and the two of them stood together at the observation deck's edge for a while longer, watching the dark beyond the platform's viewport where, faint and steady, the running lights of a Longwatch honor guard held station in the same volume of space the picket fleet had occupied on the day of the engagement. Visible now, deliberately, banked orange along their hulls rather than dark and silent. A fleet that no longer needed to hide because the thing it had spent a century and a half concealing had already been seen and understood and could not be unseen again. The ceremony itself, when it began, was shorter and plainer than Iliad had expected from an event that 14 months of careful diplomacy had built toward. A formal reading of the treaty's terms by High Arbiter Petrus Vol, considerably more careful in his phrasing now than he had been on the day he pronounced humanity powerless. A countersignature from Overseer Rin Caldry, whose 4 hands, Iliad noticed, did not fold into the posture of satisfied closure even once during the entire proceeding, and a brief, formal statement from Commodore Voss that ran to less than 2 minutes and said, in substance, considerably less than the 4-hour briefing Iliad had received aboard the diplomatic courier a year earlier, but landed in the quiet of the assembled delegates, with a weight the longer briefing had somehow not carried. Sol Defense Command did not build this fleet to conquer anyone, Voss said, standing at the small podium the ceremony's organizers had set up near the platform's center, her voice carrying the same flat, unhurried economy it had carried during the engagement itself, and every hour since. We built it because we understood, better than we would have liked to, what happens to a people who are cataloged by someone else's convenience and left undefended by someone else's carelessness. We would have been glad, genuinely and without reservation, to have this treaty signed a century ago, under circumstances that cost nobody anything. It was not signed a century ago. It is signed today, at a cost that both sides will be counting for a long time. I do not think either side should forget that cost simply because the outcome from here looks like peace. Peace built on a corrected mistake is still peace. But it is worth remembering, every time a survey comes up for renewal, exactly how the mistake got made in the first place, so that the next one, because there is always a next one, somewhere, eventually, gets caught before it costs 11,400 ships instead of after. Marshal Drethkos attended the ceremony as well, seated in the observer section reserved for the Combine's former command staff, stripped of rank but permitted, at his own request, and over some internal Combine objection, to be present for what he had described, in his own formal statement to the Inquiry Board months earlier, as an obligation he owed to every crew member who had not survived the campaign he ordered. He did not speak during the ceremony. He approached Iliad afterward, in the slow milling crowd that gathered once the formal proceedings ended, and stood for a moment in a silence that Iliad, after 14 months of learning to read the particular weight different silences carried, understood he was working to fill without quite finding the words. Adjunct Sorn, he said finally, I understand you're the one who found the footnote, before the engagement I mean, the gap in the survey. I found a note someone else flagged a century and a half before I was ever assigned the file, Iliad said. I renewed the license 11 times without reading it. I don't think I've earned the credit you're offering me, Marshal. Maybe not, Koss said. But you're the one who stood up in that chamber and said it out loud, while I was 400 light-years away giving the order that made it matter. I've had 14 months to think about the difference between those two things. I don't come out of that thinking especially well, if I'm honest about it. He paused, and something in his weathered, diminished bearing shifted, briefly, into something closer to the confidence Iliad imagined he must have carried before the campaign that ended his career. For what it's worth, I don't think the file was a lie. I think it was worse than a lie. A lie someone has to actively tell. Nobody told this one. We just all agreed, generation after generation, not to check. He did not wait for a response before turning and making his way slowly toward the platform's transit bay, and Iliad watched him go with the particular, complicated grief she had come to associate with almost everyone touched by the Sol campaign. Not forgiveness exactly, and not condemnation either, but something more like the recognition that a mistake this large did not belong to any single hand on any single pen. however much any single person involved might wish. For the sake of a simpler story, that it did. Tavi Korsh, promoted twice in the 14 months since his testimony and now serving as the Combine's youngest sensor division commander, found Iliot later that same evening at the reception. The Accord's diplomatic office had arranged aboard a second platform docked alongside the ceremony's main venue, and greeted her with a directness that made her, after a long day of careful diplomatic phrasing, unexpectedly grateful. "I read your survey report," he said. "All 900 pages. Twice, actually. I wanted to understand exactly what we missed and why in enough detail that I'd never make the same mistake in my own command." "That's more thorough reading than most of the delegates who voted on the reform managed," Iliot said. "I had a personal stake in it," Korsh said, and something flickered briefly across his young, serious face. "I keep thinking about the 41 times the anomaly showed up in 6 days, 41 returns, the same number as the decoy ships we destroyed on the first day. I never did figure out if that was coincidence." "It wasn't," said a voice behind them, and both turned to find Naomi Voss, out of the formal uniform she'd worn for the ceremony now, dressed considerably more plainly for the reception, holding a drink she had not yet touched. The picket commanders logged every scan that brushed the shroud's edge during those 6 days. 41 decoys, 41 confirmed sensor brushes. We counted them the same way you did, Commander. It wasn't a message, if that's what you're wondering. It was just an honest coincidence that happened to land on a number that meant something to both sides. We noticed it too. Nobody planned it that way." Korsh considered that for a moment, and something in his expression suggested the answer mattered to him more than the question's small scale probably warranted. "I think I'm glad it wasn't a message," he said finally. "I think I'd rather believe the universe occasionally lines up a coincidence like that on its own, without anyone intending it as a lesson. Easier to live with somehow." "For what it's worth," Voss said, "so would I." The reform Iliot had fought to pass through the Accord Assembly did not sit quietly on record for long. 8 months after the treaty ceremony, in a system 41 light-years from Sol that had nothing to do with humanity, the Combine, or any of the parties involved in the Sol reversal, a routine independent re-verification, mandatory now for any survey older than 25 years, exactly as Iliot's reform required, turned up an 11% gap in the recorded volume of a small, unremarkable world called Ket Oren. Catalogued 190 years earlier as agriculturally marginal and militarily negligible by a survey team that had, like Kato Rahim's team before them, simply run out of time and equipment to finish the job properly, and filed an incomplete report rather than delay a schedule. It was Iliot Sorn, now the Accord's senior coordinator for survey integrity, a title that had not existed 14 months earlier, and that she still found faintly strange to hear attached to her own name, who received the flag on Ket Oren's file, and who understood, reading the report at her own desk with a speed born of exhausted, hard-won familiarity, exactly how close the system stood to repeating, in miniature, everything Sol had already survived at catastrophic cost. A minor territorial claim was already pending against Ket Oren, filed by a small mining consortium with connections to interests that had, Iliot noted with some grim satisfaction, quietly declined to press similar claims anywhere near Sol space since the treaty. The consortium's claim relied, in substantial part, on the century-old survey's confident assertion of negligible defensive capability. The same phrase, nearly word for word, that had once condemned Iliot's own signature to 141 years of unexamined renewal. She did not wait for the Accord's usual committee process to run its slow, deliberate course. She invoked, for the first time since the reform's passage, the emergency verification clause the reform itself had created, and within a week had a small independent survey vessel, crewed, deliberately, with 2 junior catalogers she had personally trained in the 14 months since the Sol reversal, both instructed, explicitly and repeatedly, to flag anything that did not resolve cleanly rather than filter it as noise, en route to Ket Oren's unresolved volume. What they found there was not another Sol Defense Command. Ket Oren's inhabitants, a quiet, insular species who called themselves the Oven, and who had spent the century since their last survey developing not warships, but an elaborate, decentralized system of hidden agricultural shelters against a native predator species. The original survey team had never bothered to document, possessed nothing remotely resembling a fleet, hidden or otherwise. But the survey gap, when Iliot's team finally resolved it, revealed something that mattered nearly as much. An entire settled population, numbering in the low millions, living in the exact volume the original survey had marked negligible, who would have been directly in the path of the mining consortium's proposed extraction operations, had the claim been approved on the old file's authority. The claim was withdrawn within the month, once the corrected survey reached the Accord Assembly, and the Oven, after some initial and understandable wariness toward Accord officials that took Iliot the better part of a difficult, patient season to work past, were granted, for the first time in the century since their world had been catalogued and then quietly forgotten, formal recognition and protected status under Accord law. There was no engagement. There were no ships, no ultimatums, no 30-second countdowns. It was, in the flat administrative language of Iliot's own closing report, an entirely unremarkable outcome. A claim reviewed, a gap resolved, a population protected, a file corrected before anyone had cause to die over its errors. And it was precisely that unremarkable quality, she would tell colleagues for years afterward whenever anyone asked her why the reform mattered as much as she insisted it did. That made Ket Oren the proof the whole exhausting 14 months of reform work had been worth fighting for. Sol had been the disaster that forced the lesson. Ket Oren was the lesson, actually learned, actually applied, before the disaster had the chance to repeat itself. She thought, standing at the edge of the Oven's largest agricultural shelter on the day, the corrected survey's findings were formally read into their own local record, of Commodore Voss's words at the treaty ceremony. Peace built on a corrected mistake is still peace, but it is worth remembering exactly how the mistake got made, and found, for the first time in 14 months, that the words no longer felt like an accusation she carried alone. They felt, instead, like the beginning of a habit she had spent every day since the Sol reversal trying, deliberately and with considerably more diligence than she had ever managed with the file that started everything, to build. Word of the Ket Oren verification reached Sol Defense Command through the same diplomatic channels that had, by then, become a regular, almost routine feature of Accord-Sol relations, and it was Commander Priya Adami who forwarded Iliot a short personal message a few weeks later, transmitted on her own initiative rather than through any official liaison protocol. "The Commodore read your report on Ket Oren," the message said. "She asked me to tell you she thought you'd want to know it made her feel, for the first time since the treaty was signed, that the corrected file might actually mean something beyond our own system. She doesn't say things like that often. I thought you should hear it." Iliot kept that message, in the years that followed, in the same small personal archive, where she had once kept nothing more than the routine renewal confirmations of a file she had never fully read. It sat, in her own private catalog, beside a handful of other documents she had come to think of, quietly and without ever saying so aloud to anyone, as the actual record of what the Sol reversal had cost and what it had, eventually, purchased in return. Tavi Korsh's testimony transcript. Marshal Koss's brief, unresolved apology on the treaty platform. The corrected 900-page survey that had replaced Kato Ram's century-and-a-half-old assumptions with something closer to the truth. And the Ket Oren report, filed under a heading she had chosen for it herself, in the plain, unornamented language she had come to prefer over the confident summaries her old file had once taught her to trust without question. Population, not yet fully known. Recommend continued verification. 5 years after the vote that had started it all, Iliot Sorn returned to Sol Space for what she privately expected, and told her own staff, would be her final visit before retirement. A courtesy tour rather than a working survey, arranged at Commander Adami's own invitation to mark the 5th anniversary of the treaty's signing, and conducted, this time, without the careful diplomatic formality that had shaped every prior visit. The system had changed in ways that went beyond the formal recognition the treaty had granted it. The Longwatch Fleet no longer operated exclusively from concealment. A portion of it, smaller than the full 41,000 hulls Iliot had once been briefed on, but substantial enough that its running lights were visible now from the inner planets with unaided eyes, on clear nights, as a slow drifting band of banked orange across the dark held open, acknowledged station at the edges of cislunar space, a permanent and undisguised reminder of exactly what had been there all along. Accord vessels moved freely through the system now, under agreements that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier, and a modest but growing exchange of trade, technology, and cautious diplomatic staff had begun to knit Sol into the wider accord in ways that Cato Ram, filing his fond, careful notes about cathedrals a century and a half earlier, could scarcely have imagined. Iliot found Commodore Voss, still commanding, though her authority had expanded considerably in the intervening years to cover the whole of Sol Defense Command's diplomatic posture rather than a single picket fleet, aboard the same courier-class vessel that had once carried Iliot to her first, transformative briefing, and the two of them spent the better part of an afternoon in the same forward observation deck, watching the same slow dark where the fleet still, occasionally, moved without announcing itself. Out of habit as much as necessity. "You look tired," Voss said, without much preamble, in the flat direct manner Iliot had long since stopped finding surprising. "I am tired," Iliot said. "I've spent 5 years correcting other people's footnotes. It's slower work than anyone expects, and it never quite finishes the way a person wants it to." "Do you regret it, any of it?" Iliot considered the question with the same careful honesty she had brought to every difficult question since the day the vote passed. "I regret that it took a catastrophe to make anyone listen," she said. "I don't regret the work since. I think," she paused, watching the faint drift of light far out past the belt. "I think I understand now why you built what you built, even though I still find the scale of it difficult to hold in my mind all at once. I used to think safety was a document. A file correctly filed, correctly renewed. I understand now that it's a practice. Something you do every day, deliberately, whether or not anyone's watching to see if you've done it. The file failed because filing was the only thing anyone ever actually did with it. Your fleet worked because building it was never the point. Watching and waiting, and being ready to be wrong about your own restraint if the moment demanded it, that was the actual work, the part nobody wrote down in any registry." Voss was quiet for a while after that, looking out at the same dark Iliot had been watching, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of the flat economy it usually carried, settling into something closer, Iliot thought, to the voice of a woman who had spent 11 years of her life hoping never to need the fleet she'd trained to command, and had spent the 5 years since living with the knowledge that the hope had not, in the end, been enough. "I still think about the 90 seconds, Voss said, "the ultimatum. I've replayed it more times than I'd want anyone to know, whether there was a version of that day where I gave the combine formation 180 seconds instead of 90, or 200, whether a slower countdown would have changed anything, cost anyone less. I don't think it would have. Trell's own inquiry testimony says the same. Koss's chain of command was too slow, structurally, no matter how much time I'd offered. But I still think about it. I expect I'll keep thinking about it for a long time yet." "For what it's worth," Iliot said, echoing, deliberately, the phrase Voss herself had used aboard the Courier 5 years earlier. "I don't think anyone who watched that engagement from the Accord's own chamber believes you owed the Combine a longer countdown. 11,400 ships crossed an active border with a beacon tender at the heart of their formation. You gave them 90 seconds, and an honest warning neither the marshal nor his vice-marshal believed until it was too late to matter. I've spent 5 years reading every survey document I can find on species who did considerably less, historically, before deciding a border crossing justified force. Nobody in this accord has any standing to ask you for more restraint than you already showed. Voss looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression, tired, guarded, carrying the particular weight of a person who had spent a decade preparing for a single terrible day, and would spend the rest of her life living with what that day had cost. However justified the cost had been, eased, very slightly, into something Iliot was fairly sure, after 5 years of careful study, she could finally recognize as gratitude. "You've gotten better at this," Voss said. "The honesty, it didn't used to come this easily to you." "No," Iliot agreed. "It didn't. I had to learn it the same way I learned everything else that mattered in the end. By getting it catastrophically wrong first, and then spending the rest of my career making sure I understood exactly why." The name Saul carried differently across the Accord systems by the time Iliot's 5th anniversary visit drew to its close, and she had watched that shift happen slowly enough, over the years of her reform work, that she had not fully registered its scale, until she began hearing the system's name spoken by strangers who had never read a single page of her survey and would never need to. It had become, in the careless shorthand that spread across relay networks the way such things always did, less a designation on a star chart than a kind of parable. The system the old file called Powerless, the fleet that waited a century and a half to be seen, the 90 seconds that ended an armada. Iliot had heard delegates at Accord committee sessions invoke it, half joking and half in earnest, whenever a survey renewal came up for a vote with a gap in it nobody wanted to spend the time resolving. "Don't Saul it," someone would say, and the room would go quiet in a way it never used to before the phrase existed, and the renewal would get flagged for proper re-verification instead of waved through on habit. She did not love that the lesson had calcified into a phrase people used without thinking too hard about what it had actually cost. 11,400 ships, a marshal's ruined career, 118 crews gone in 4 seconds, a young ensign who still, by his own admission in a letter he sent Iliot every year around the anniversary, dreamed sometimes about the numbers on his own console before the hit that took 60% of his ship's forward mass. But she understood, watching the phrase spread and do its slow, quiet work across 100 committee rooms she would never personally sit in, that this was probably the best outcome a mistake of that size could realistically produce. Not perfect vigilance, which no institution built by any species had ever managed to sustain indefinitely, but a phrase short enough to survive in casual use, attached firmly enough to a real and terrible cost that invoking it carelessly still made people uncomfortable in a way that mattered. Tavi Korsh's letters, which had arrived every year without fail since his testimony, told her, in the 5th one, that he had been given command of his own cruiser, the first ensign from his academy class to reach that rank, a fact he mentioned with more pride than Iliot suspected he would ever admit to a superior officer, though he seemed entirely comfortable admitting it to her. He had named the ship standing censor protocol, informally and against considerable internal resistance from officers who found the name faintly embarrassing, the 41 rule. Any anomalous return appearing more than 3 times in a rolling 7-day window was to be formally logged and escalated regardless of how confidently a senior officer dismissed it as noise, no exceptions, no deference to rank. He had implemented it, he wrote, the week he took command, and had already caught, in the 18 months since, 2 genuine anomalies that an earlier generation of combined censor doctrine would have filtered out exactly the way his own commander had once filtered his. Marshal Koss did not write letters. Iliot heard about him only second-hand, through the same relay channels that carried most news out of Combine space. And what she heard, in the years after the treaty ceremony, was neither redemption nor further disgrace but something quieter, and, she suspected, considerably harder for a man of his former stature to live inside. He had taken a teaching post at a junior officers' academy on a minor Combine world, instructing new recruits in a mandatory course the Combine's Reformed War Ministry had introduced in the wake of the inquiry, formally titled Survey Verification and Command Judgment, and informally known, among the cadets who took it, simply as CAS's course. He never spoke, according to the one account that reached Elliot through a mutual contact in the Accord's diplomatic office, about his own record in any detail beyond what the official inquiry transcript already contained. He simply made every cadet read Ensign Korsh's testimony aloud, in full, on the first day of every term, and told them, before dismissing the class, that he expected every one of them to be able to explain, by the term's end, exactly what a 3-month ensign had understood that he, with 30 years of command experience, had not. Yeva Rask, the officer whose unauthorized incursion had briefly threatened to unravel the fragile peace 6 weeks after the engagement, resigned her commission within the year, and, in an irony Elliot found she could not help but find at least a little satisfying, took a position with the Combine's own newly expanded Survey Verification Office. The same office, structurally, that Elliot's reform had helped establish on the Accord side, tasked with rechecking exactly the kind of stale, unresolved data that Fleet Minister Barrett's theory had once tried to wave away as irrelevant. She wrote to Elliot only once, a short and formal note thanking her for the reform's existence, and closing with a line Elliot kept, alongside Adami's message about Ket Oren in the same small private archive. I spent 20 years trusting orders more than my own instruments. I would like to spend whatever years I have left doing the opposite. Overseer Rin Caldry remained in office, chastened but not removed, her 4 hands never again folding, in Elliot's observation across half a dozen subsequent sessions, into quite the same posture of satisfied closure they had held on the day the vote first passed. She became, somewhat to Elliot's surprise, one of the reform's most consistent defenders in later committee sessions, arguing for its extension to territorial claims beyond the original scope Elliot had proposed, not out of any warmth toward Saul Defense Command, which Elliot doubted Caldry would ever fully feel, but out of what Elliot came to recognize, over the years, as the particular, useful caution of someone who had watched her own confident certainty proven catastrophically wrong in front of an entire assembled chamber, and had no intention of standing in that position twice. Elliot's own retirement, when it finally came a little over 6 years after the vote, was a quiet affair by her own explicit request, no chamber ceremony, no formal reading of her record into the permanent archive, nothing that echoed the grand, irreversible weight of the session where everything had started. She asked instead for a single afternoon aboard a small Accord research vessel, granted one final escorted pass through the outer reaches of Sol space before her formal duties transferred to the 2 junior catalogers she had trained, both of whom had long since internalized the habit she had spent 6 years trying to make instinct rather than policy. When a number does not resolve cleanly, you do not file it away as instrument fault. You go back. You look again. She stood on that final afternoon at the same observation deck, where she had first seen the picket fleet resolve out of the ordinary scattered dark, 6 years and 1 lifetime of careful, exhausting reform work earlier, and found the view had lost none of its power to still something in her chest, even now, even after dozens of subsequent visits had long since worn the shock of it down to something closer to familiar respect. The fleet held station where it always did, running lights banked low but no longer hidden, hull weathering visible now even at this distance as a faint texture of scars and scorch marks along flanks that had, 6 years ago, absorbed the worst the Volt Combine's arsenal could throw at them without losing a single ship anyone had ever been able to confirm destroyed. Somewhere among those hulls, she knew, Naomi Voss still held her command, older now, considerably more decorated, but carrying, in the handful of messages the two women still exchanged every few months, an old habit neither had ever formally decided to keep and neither had ever let lapse, the same flat, careful economy she had carried since the day her voice first cut across an open Combine channel and told a marshal's vice-marshal that 90 seconds were not a bluff. Priya Adami had been promoted twice more since the treaty ceremony and now held, at an age Iliot still found faintly startling for the responsibility it carried, the senior diplomatic liaison post between Sol Defense Command and the Full Threshold Accord, a role that had not existed before the Sol reversal, and that both sides now considered, after 6 years of steady if occasionally difficult use, indispensable. Marcus Webb, the young lieutenant who had told a captured marshal that the file was wrong and had always been going to be wrong eventually, commanded his own ship now, a picket vessel assigned to one of the outer colonies whose location the Accord's corrected survey listed, for the first time in its recorded history, with genuine precision rather than convenient approximation. Iliot thought, standing there in the quiet hum of the research vessel's observation deck, of every version of the file she had ever signed, renewed, or corrected across a career that had begun with a simple summary page, and ended, improbably, with a standing reform bearing her own name in half the Accord's internal correspondence, whether she wanted the credit or not. She thought of Cato Ram's fond, careful notes about cathedrals and long poems about small things, written by a man who had genuinely liked the species he was cataloging and had still, through nothing more sinister than an honest instrument failure and an institution's collective unwillingness to double back and check its own footnotes, helped set in motion a mistake that took 11,400 ships and 118 crews in 4 seconds to fully correct. And she thought, most of all, of the last line of her own final report, filed the week before her retirement and forwarded, at her own request, not just to the Accord's permanent archive but to Sol Defense Command's own liaison office, so that both sides of the treaty would hold the same closing words in their respective records, rather than two different versions shaped by two different institutional comforts. The mistake was never that the file called them small, she had written. Raham's own notes never claimed they were small. He thought them stubborn and resourceful and worth respecting even at their most modest. The mistake was that nobody after him ever thought to ask whether small, once written down, might simply have stopped being true the moment no one was looking closely enough to notice it change. Every file describes a moment. No moment holds still. The discipline this Accord failed to keep, and that I hope we have finally, at catastrophic cost, learned to keep going forward, is the discipline of remembering that the file is never the system. It is only ever the last time someone bothered to look. The research vessel's pilot gave her, without being asked, one final courtesy before turning the ship back toward the transit corridor that would carry Iliot home for the last time as a serving Accord official. A slow pass along the outer edge of the picket formation, close enough that the fleet's true scale filled the observation deck's viewport in a way no tactical plot or briefing summary had ever quite managed to convey, even after 6 years of trying. She watched the hull slide past, scarred, weathered, alive with the small orange glow of engines that had sat banked and patient for 130 years before anyone outside Sol Defense Command had known to look for them, and that now held station in open acknowledgement, no longer a secret, no longer a footnote, no longer anything the next cataloger to inherit a survey file could plausibly fail to notice, and found herself thinking, with a clarity she had not quite reached even at the height of her reform work, about the particular shape of the mistake the Accord had made and the particular shape of the answer it had received. They had called the system powerless because a document said so, and a document had said so because a survey had been incomplete, and the survey had been incomplete because 11% of a volume of space had returned readings that made no sense to instruments calibrated for a universe built, as far as anyone understood it, mostly out of the ordinary lit matter that made up stars and planets and ships. It had never once occurred to anyone filing that footnote, in 145 years of renewals, that the gap itself might be the answer rather than the failure, that a species with reason to hide might choose to hide inside exactly the part of the universe every other species had already agreed, by long habit and easy assumption, was too dark, too diffuse, too fundamentally unpromising to bother looking into twice. Dark matter made up most of everything that existed, and almost no one who built warships or wrote survey reports had ever thought to ask what might be waiting, patiently, inside all that unlit mass that filled the space between the stars everyone actually bothered to chart. Humanity had asked. Humanity had built an answer into its own hulls, wrapped it around dreadnoughts that could sit unseen for 130 years in the part of the universe every other survey team treated as empty by definition, and had waited, with a discipline that still, 6 years later, struck Iliad as almost impossible to fully credit, for the one moment when hiding would finally cost more than being seen. The moment had come on a single afternoon, in a chamber 400 light-years from the ships themselves, when a bell rang 3 times and a word "Powerless" became, for the length of one 90-second countdown, the most catastrophically wrong sentence any institution in the region had spoken in living memory. And then the dark had simply opened, the way it always could have, the way it had been capable of opening for 130 patient years, and the galaxy had learned, in 52 minutes and 206 surviving ships, exactly what had been sitting inside its own convenient blind spot the entire time. Iliad thought of Marshal Koss's words on the shattered command deck of his flagship, recorded and quoted in every history that had been written since. The file said you were powerless. The file was signed. She thought of Lieutenant Webb's answer, quieter and considerably more accurate. The file was wrong. It was always going to be wrong eventually. We just made sure it stayed wrong long enough to matter. The research vessel completed its slow pass and began, at last, to turn for home, and Iliad Sorn stood at the viewport a moment longer, watching the picket formation recede into the ordinary scattered dark it had once used so completely to disappear, and understood, with the particular finality of a career closing exactly where it had been forced to begin, that the file she had signed 11 times without reading past its summary page had never actually been a record of what humanity was. It had only ever been a record of how long the galaxy could go on choosing not to look, until the day a single council declared a single word into the permanent archive, and the dark past the edge of every convenient survey answered, calmly and all at once, that it had been there the entire time, watching, waiting, and very much not what anyone had signed it to be. Commodore Voss met her one final time before the research vessel departed the system for good, not aboard the flagship this time, but at a small way station platform near the edge of cislunar space, where Sol Defense Command maintained a modest liaison office for exactly the kind of unhurried, informal farewell neither woman had ever quite found the occasion for during 6 years of committee sessions, inquiry testimony, and careful diplomatic correspondence. Voss arrived without ceremony, in the same plain uniform she had worn to the reception after the treaty ceremony, and the two of them sat for a while in a small observation lounge that looked out, through a modest viewport rather than the vast sweeping windows of the flagship's own bridge, at the ordinary, unremarkable dark of open space. "I never asked you," Voss said, after a silence that had settled between them comfortably rather than awkwardly, the way silences between old colleagues eventually learn to do, "whether you regret staying in this work as long as you did. You could have taken a quieter post after the first year. Most people would have." "I thought about it," Iliad admitted. "There were easier assignments, cataloging trade routes, border maintenance in systems that had never had a file worth revising in the first place. She considered the question with the same careful honesty she had brought to every hard question in the 6 years since the vote. I stayed because I kept thinking about Ket Oren. Not Saul. Saul forced itself on me. There was never really a choice in that. But Ket Oren was a choice. Nobody made me chase that flag down before the committee process would have gotten to it eventually, on its own slow schedule, probably in time, probably without disaster. I chased it because I understood, by then, that in time and probably were the exact words that had let the original file sit unread for 145 years. I didn't want to be the kind of cataloger who trusted those words again, not after I'd already learned what they cost. That's a heavier answer than I expected, Voss said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice, an unguardedness Iliot had rarely heard from her even after 6 years of increasingly frank correspondence. You asked a heavy question, Iliot said. I've found, since the vote, that most of the honest answers are heavier than the polite version people expect. I stopped giving the polite version somewhere around the 3rd year. It didn't seem worth the effort anymore, and I don't think it ever actually helped anyone. Voss was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark beyond the viewport. The same dark, Iliot reflected, that had once hidden 1,140 warships from every instrument the Combine's advance flotilla had brought to bear on it, and that now held nothing more dramatic than the ordinary scattered light of a system going about its ordinary business, ships moving on ordinary errands. A piece neither side had ever expected to reach this easily going about the unremarkable work of simply continuing, day after day, to hold. I used to think the hardest part of this command would be the day the fleet finally had to fight, Voss said finally. 11 years of preparation, all pointed at one terrible afternoon. And then the afternoon came and it was terrible, and it ended in 52 minutes, and I thought foolishly, I understand now that the hard part was over. It wasn't. The hard part turned out to be everything after, making sure the terrible afternoon actually meant something, instead of just being a battle we won, and then slowly, quietly, let the world forget the way it forgets most battles eventually. You did that. More than almost anyone else on either side of that treaty, you're the reason it didn't just become a story people tell without changing anything. I don't think I ever told you that as plainly as I should have. You just did, Iliot said. For what it's worth, I'll take it. It's not nothing coming from you. No, Voss agreed. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. They sat together a while longer in the small observation lounge. 2 women from species that had spent 145 years failing entirely to understand each other, watching the same unremarkable dark that had once held the largest secret either of their civilizations had ever kept, and said, eventually, the kind of quiet, unceremonious goodbye that people who have survived something enormous together tend to say, not dramatic, not especially memorable in its own words, but carrying. Underneath the ordinary phrasing, the full weight of everything 6 years had built between them. Iliot's research vessel cleared the edge of Sol space 4 hours later, passing, on its way out, the same volume of dark past the 9th world where a survey team 145 years earlier had first written the words instrument fault into a report that no one, for a century and a half, had thought carefully enough to question. The volume looked, from the viewport, exactly like every other stretch of open space the vessel had crossed on its long journey home. Quiet, unremarkable, empty, to any instrument not specifically calibrated to know better. Iliot Sorn looked at it for a long time before the vessel's transit drive finally engaged, and did not, this time, feel the need to reach for a data pad, or a survey file, or a summary page written by someone who had done his honest best a century and a half ago with instruments that had simply not been built to see what was actually there. She had learned, in the 6 years since a bell rang 3 times in a chamber 400 light-years from where she now sat, that some things did not need a file to be true. They only needed someone, eventually, willing to look long enough, and carefully enough, to notice that the dark was never actually empty at all, that it had simply been waiting, patient, and unhurried, and entirely undeceived by any word an institution chose to sign against it, for the exact moment it finally mattered to be seen. 7 years to the day after the vote that had once declared humanity powerless, the Threshold Accords chamber convened for an entirely different kind of session. A routine confirmation hearing, unremarkable by every measure except the date on the calendar, called to review a fresh set of survey renewals for a cluster of minor systems on the Accord's furthest frontier. Iliot Sorn attended not as an official but as a private observer, seated in the same archivist's gallery where she had once sat with her hands laced tight enough to ache, watching a new generation of catalogers do the work she had spent the better part of a career teaching them to do properly. The presiding officer was not High Arbiter Petrus Val, who had retired the previous year to considerably less fanfare than his own long tenure might have warranted, but a younger arbiter named Kasia Oest, who had cut her teeth on the Accord's committee system during the years of Iliot's reform work, and had absorbed its lessons. Iliot thought watching her preside, more thoroughly than anyone of Val's own generation ever fully managed. The renewal in question concerned a small, unremarkable world on the frontier's furthest edge, its file overdue for the mandatory 25-year re-verification the reform required, and the adjunct cataloger presenting it, a young Thren named Osset Pharaoh, barely 3 years into the post Iliot herself had once held for 2 full decades, reached the file's closing pages and paused, visibly, before the assembled chamber. "Arbiter," Pharaoh said, "the independent verification team flagged an unresolved gap in the survey's outer volume, approximately 9% of recorded space, attributed in the original filing to instrument limitations during the survey period. Under the standing reform, I am required to recommend the renewal be held pending full re-verification before any claim against the system can be considered." It was such a small thing, Iliot thought, watching from the gallery. 9%, instrument limitations, a junior cataloger doing precisely what the reform required without a flicker of the institutional hesitation that had once let an identical flag sit ignored for 145 years. Arbiter Oest did not weigh the recommendation against a confident dismissal from any observing delegation, did not treat the flag as an inconvenience to be argued past. She simply nodded, made a brief note for the record, and moved the matter to the Accord's verification schedule without further debate, the way a chamber moves any item that has stopped being controversial because the argument over whether it should be controversial has already, permanently, been settled. Iliot watched the session close a short while later, the chamber emptying in the ordinary, unhurried way sessions emptied when nothing dramatic had happened, when no bell had rung 3 times to seal an irreversible mistake into the permanent record, when a 9% gap had simply been noted, flagged, and scheduled, rather than signed away on the comfortable strength of an old assumption nobody had thought to question. She sat a while longer in the emptying gallery, alone with the quiet hum of the chamber's systems powering down for the evening, and found herself thinking, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, not of Cato Ram's careful notes or Marshal Cass's ruined career or the 90 seconds that had once ended an armada, but simply of the plain, unremarkable fact of what she had just watched happen. A system on the furthest edge of everything the Accord claimed to understand, its file incomplete in exactly the way Saul's file had once been incomplete, its gap caught and flagged and scheduled for honest correction before a single claim could be filed against it, before a single ship needed to cross a single border, before a single word like powerless could be spoken into any chamber's permanent record and mistaken, even for a moment, for the truth. No fleet had needed to appear out of the dark to make that happen. No bell had needed to ring 3 times before anyone understood the cost of getting it wrong. It had simply become, in the 7 years since a single terrible afternoon forced the lesson home, the ordinary shape of how the work was done, quiet, unremarkable, entirely without spectacle. And for exactly that reason, Iliot thought, rising at last from the archivist's gallery and making her way toward the chamber's wide doors and the quiet evening beyond them, the truest measure of everything the Sol reversal had ultimately purchased. Somewhere past the edge of every survey anyone had ever filed, in the long cold dark that instruments calibrated for ordinary lit matter had always struggled to fully resolve, a fleet of warships that had waited 130 patient years to be seen now held open, acknowledged station, running lights banked low but no longer hidden, no longer a footnote, no longer anything the next cataloger to inherit a survey file could plausibly overlook. They had not moved to conquer anything in the 7 years since the galaxy first learned what they were. They had not needed to. The lesson, once delivered, did not require repeating, only remembering, carefully and deliberately, in every renewal, every re-verification, every quiet, unremarkable session where a young cataloger flagged a gap instead of signing past it, the way an entire region of the galaxy had once learned, in 52 catastrophic minutes, that the dark was never actually empty. It had simply been waiting to be asked to look back. Years later, long after Iliot Sorn's name had faded from the daily business of the Threshold Accord, and settled instead into the quiet permanence of a reform still bearing her signature in half the region's survey archives, a new cataloger somewhere on the Accord's ever-expanding frontier would open a file grown old enough to require re-verification, find a gap in its outer volume that some tired survey team a generation earlier had chalked up to instrument fault, and pause. The way every properly trained cataloger now paused, out of habit rather than fear, before deciding, without needing to be told twice, that the gap deserved a second look before anyone signed anything against it. They would not always find a fleet. Most of the time they would find nothing at all, an honest sensor limitation, a stretch of ordinary vacuum, a file that had simply grown old the way files always did, in need of nothing more dramatic than updating. That too was part of what the lesson had purchased, the discipline to look carefully at every gap, not because every gap concealed a warship, but because no one could any longer afford to assume, on the comfortable strength of habit alone, which gaps did and which did not. And on the rare occasion when a cataloger did find something waiting in the unresolved dark, a hidden colony, an overlooked population, a species that had learned, the hard way or the careful way, the value of not being fully seen until being seen finally mattered, they would remember, whether or not they had ever read Iliot Sorn's own closing report in full, the plain, unadorned lesson that report had left behind for exactly this purpose. The file is never the system. It is only ever the last time someone bothered to look. And somewhere past the edge of whatever any file currently claimed to know, in the long patient dark between the stars that every lit and catalogued world still too easily mistook for empty, something might yet be waiting, unhurried, undeceived, and perfectly willing, when the moment finally demanded it, to answer for itself. That was the part the histories rarely captured, in Iliot's own later, private judgment. Not the 52 minutes, not the 206 surviving ships, not even the 90 seconds that had ended an armada, but the 130 quiet years that came before any of it. The years no chamber ever read into any record because nothing had happened in them that a file could easily summarize. A species building, slowly and without fanfare, in the coldest and least promising reaches of its own home system, trusting that patience mattered more than proof, that restraint counted for more than spectacle, that a fleet built to be seen too early would only teach the galaxy the wrong lesson about who they were. There had been no ceremony in those 130 years. No one had signed anything to make them real. They had simply gone on existing, unwitnessed and unhurried, in the exact volume of space an old survey had once decided was not worth a second look, and had been right in the end, to trust that the day would eventually come when looking again would matter more than anything a footnote could have said in their defense. Iliot thought of that patience often, in the quiet years of her own retirement, Whenever she found herself standing at a window on a clear night on her homeworld, looking up at a sky full of stars, she had spent a career learning to read as data points rather than light. She would think of the picket fleet still holding its slow, bank-torn station, past the edge of a system that had once been catalogued, carelessly and completely wrongly, as powerless, ships that had learned, long before any Accord chamber ever forced the lesson on the rest of the galaxy, that the most dangerous kind of strength was the kind that never needed to announce itself until the exact moment silence stopped being enough. And somewhere, on nights when the light was right and the sky was clear enough, she liked to imagine, though she never once wrote it into any official report, because it was not the kind of thing a cataloger could ever properly verify, that the fleet was still out there exactly as it had always been, patient and weathered and quietly, permanently awake, holding its long watch over a small blue world that the rest of the galaxy had finally, at catastrophic and unforgettable cost, learned never to underestimate again. The bell had rung 3 times once in a chamber 400 light-years from anywhere that mattered, and a single careless word had nearly cost a civilization everything it had spent 130 patient years building in the dark. It never rang that way again. Not because the danger of easy assumptions had vanished from the galaxy, it had not, and Iliad had spent too many years chasing down its smaller, quieter echoes to believe it ever fully would, but because somewhere past the edge of every file anyone would ever sign, humanity's warships still held their watch in the dark matter no one had thought to search, waiting without needing to be thanked for it, ready without needing to be feared for it, and entirely, finally, impossible to mistake for Powerless ever again.